She was born into one of the richest families in American history. By the time she died, she was almost blind, addicted to pills, and living alone in a hotel room. They called her the poor little rich girl, not because she lacked money, but because money never saved her. Before she turned 30, she had lost her mother, been married and divorced multiple times, and become a global symbol of excess and tragedy. Men wanted her fortune, the public wanted her downfall, and the world watched as her billions slowly disappeared. This is not a fairy tale about wealth. It's a warning, because behind the diamonds, the castles, the Hollywood husbands, and the headlines was a 5-year-old girl who learned too early that money can buy everything except safety, except love, and except peace. Stay with me, because this story doesn't begin with riches. It begins with a locked bedroom door and a child who would never be the same again. High above Wilshire Boulevard, where the noise of Los Angeles dissolves into a distant, harmless murmur, there is a room that seems to exist outside of time. Barbara Hutton lives there. Not in the way people usually mean when they say, live. There is no sense of arrival, no anticipation of tomorrow. She occupies the space quietly, as if careful not to disturb it, like a guest who has stayed far too long and no longer remembers where home is supposed to be. The penthouse is tall enough that the city no longer feels human. Cars move below like slow, glowing insects. Sirens rise and fade before they can reach the windows. From this height, Los Angeles looks peaceful, almost forgiving. That illusion has value. Barbara paid dearly for it. The curtains are half drawn, not to block the sun, but to soften it. Light, at her age, is no longer friendly. It exposes too much. The years have thinned her vision, weakened her eyes, turned brightness into something sharp and invasive. The world must now be filtered before it is allowed to touch her. Near the bed stands a small table. Nothing extravagant, just a glass with a faint ring of water at its base, a plain lamp, and several prescription bottles arranged with careful precision. Their labels facing outward like tiny declarations of survival. Each one represents a negotiation between her body and the fact that it is still here. Barbara sits by the window in a wide chair that makes her look even smaller than she already is. Her frame is fragile, almost weightless, as though the room itself is holding her upright. She does not read. She does not sleep. She listens, not for anything specific, just for quiet. She has spent a lifetime surrounded by sound, applause, gossip, music, arguments, the click of cameras, the murmur of rooms filled with people who wanted something from her. Quiet, when it finally arrives, feels unfamiliar. It must be learned, the way one learns a foreign language late in life. In the mirror across the room, a woman looks back at her. The resemblance is faint. Once. That face appeared in newspapers and magazines across the world. Once. It was framed by diamonds, photographed beneath chandeliers, followed by headlines heavy with fascination and resentment. Now the diamonds are gone. The face remains, but it has been reduced to essentials: sharp cheekbones, pale skin, eyes clouded by years of illness and medication. The kind of beauty that no longer tries to be seen. Barbara Woolworth Hutton. Few names carried more weight in the 20th century. Fewer still carried as much contradiction. She was called many things in her life: heiress, socialite, billionaire, tragedy, spectacle. But the name that followed her longest, the one that refused to fade, was almost playful in its cruelty. The poor little rich girl. It sounded like a joke when it was first printed. Clever, catchy, easy to repeat. The public loved it because it allowed them to feel superior to someone who had everything. It suggested that wealth itself was punishment enough, that her suffering was deserved, or at least amusing. What the nickname never captured was how accurate it was. Barbara closes her eyes, not out of exhaustion, but habit. Darkness is simpler. In the dark, memory moves more freely. There are moments, late at night or early in the morning, when she feels the strange sensation of having outlived her own story, as if the most important chapters were written long ago, and what remains is only the slow turning of pages no one is reading anymore. She has buried husbands. She has buried illusions. She has buried a son. Money, once so vast it seemed abstract, has thinned quietly over decades, eroded by generosity, manipulation, poor decisions, and the simple cost of maintaining a life built too large to sustain itself. Fortunes rarely vanish in a single dramatic collapse. They disappear the way health does, gradually, and then all at once. The city breathes below her window. She hears it like the ocean, constant, indifferent, eternal. Los Angeles will continue whether she is here or not. That realization no longer frightens her. It feels appropriate. There was a time when she believed money could insulate her from loss. That belief did not survive childhood. There was a time when she believed marriage could save her. That belief did not survive experience. Now, near the end, belief itself feels unnecessary. What remains are questions, not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just a single, quiet thought that returns again and again. Usually when the room is darkest and the city is barely visible beyond the glass. How does a life that begins with everything end like this? The question hangs in the air without accusation. It is not bitter. It is almost curious, as if she is examining her own existence from a distance, trying to understand its shape. She does not answer it. Instead, she lets her mind drift backward, past the hotel, past the headlines, past the men and the money and the endless rooms filled with strangers. Back to a time before she knew what wealth meant, before she knew what absence felt like, before she learned that love could vanish without warning. Back to New York, back to 1912, back to a world that believed progress was permanent and tragedy was optional. Back to the moment her life truly began. And with that thought, the room fades, leaving only the echo of a child's footsteps, moving unknowingly toward a future no amount of money would ever be able to protect. New York City in the autumn of 1912 believed deeply in itself. The streets were widening. Buildings were climbing higher each year, stretching steel and stone toward a future no one doubted anymore. Horse-drawn carriages still shared the roads with motor cars, but everyone could feel the direction of things. America was accelerating. Wealth was no longer something to hide. It was something to display. It was into this mood of confidence that Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born. November 14th, 1912. She arrived quietly, unaware that her name already carried weight, that her future had been calculated before her first breath, outside the hospital. The city moved with mechanical optimism. Inside, a child entered a world that assumed money could solve what love might fail to provide. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, stood firmly within that world. He was a co-founder of E.F. Hutton and Company, an investment firm rising swiftly in the new American financial order. Franklin was charming, handsome, and ambitious, the kind of man who belonged naturally in boardrooms and dining rooms alike. He understood money not as security, but as motion. Capital was something to be circulated, expanded, enjoyed. Her mother, Edna Woolworth, came from a different strain of wealth, older, broader, more public, more. Edna was the daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, the man who transformed American retail by making everyday goods affordable to everyday people. 5 and dime stores, simple counters, fixed prices. Dignity for customers who had once been invisible to commerce. From that simplicity grew an empire. By the time Barbara was born, the Woolworth name was stamped across towns and cities from coast to coast. It was not subtle wealth. It was visible, accessible, woven into daily American life, and only months after Barbara's birth. That wealth took its most dramatic physical form. The Woolworth Building rose over Manhattan like a declaration at the time. It was the tallest building in the world, a cathedral to commerce, crowned with Gothic ornamentation, glowing at night like a monument to ambition. People stopped in the street to stare at it. Newspapers marveled at it. For the public, it symbolized possibility. For Barbara, still an infant in silk-lined rooms, it was destiny made stone. Her early years unfolded in spaces designed to reassure. Large rooms, polished furniture, servants who moved softly and spoke little. Everything necessary was present before it was requested. Comfort was not a luxury, it was the baseline. But comfort is not the same as warmth. Franklin Hutton was rarely still. Business demanded travel, society demanded appearances, and his appetites demanded indulgence. He drank heavily. He flirted openly. His affairs were not exactly secret. They were simply tolerated, spoken of in lowered voices behind closed doors. In households like the Huttons, conflict rarely announces itself loudly. It settles instead into routines. Tension hides behind etiquette. Smiles become practiced. Silence stretches. Edna Woolworth was sensitive, private, and increasingly fragile beneath the weight of expectation. She had grown up watched, evaluated, protected, and constrained by her father's empire. Marriage was supposed to be escape. Instead, it became another stage where she was expected to perform stability. After Barbara's birth, Edna's health did not improve. If anything, motherhood sharpened the imbalance in the household. Franklin remained distant. The world praised him. The world admired the Woolworth fortune. Very few noticed the woman quietly unraveling behind heavy doors. Barbara, too young to understand language, understood atmosphere. Children always do. She learned early that love could feel conditional, that attention arrived unpredictably, that rooms could be full of people and still feel empty. These lessons were not taught deliberately. They were absorbed, the way one absorbs cold through thin walls. Nannies and governesses came and went, professional and capable, offering structure where intimacy failed. They fed her, dressed her, guided her steps through well-appointed rooms. But affection delivered on a schedule does not sink deeply. It rests on the surface. By the time Barbara was old enough to walk confidently through the halls of her family homes, the marriage that surrounded her was already eroding. Franklin stayed out later. Edna withdrew further. Conversations shortened. Laughter thinned. The house learned to hold its breath. Outside, America surged forward, blind to what was quietly collapsing inside one wealthy family. Inside, a child learned to read absence before she could read words. No one yet knew that this early imbalance would echo across decades. No one imagined that the girl born into certainty would spend her life searching for something that money, lineage, and architecture could never guarantee. Safety and love that stayed. For now, she was simply a child, small, silent, exquisitely dressed, standing at the very beginning of a story the world would watch obsessively, misunderstand completely, and judge without mercy. The tragedy had not arrived yet, but the conditions were already in place. By the time Barbara was 4 years old, the house no longer felt alive. It functioned. It performed. It did what houses of that stature were meant to do: host dinners, shelter wealth, impress visitors. But something essential had drained from its walls. The rooms felt larger than necessary, as if space itself had begun to stretch in response to what was missing. Edna Woolworth spent more time alone. She moved through the house like a shadow that had lost interest in being seen. Her health faltered in ways doctors described cautiously, avoiding language that suggested despair. In families of wealth, suffering was often framed as nerves, as fatigue, as something temporary and correctable. Emotional pain, when it could not be denied, was softened into medical terminology. Franklin Hutton remained busy. Busy was his refuge. When he was present, he appeared polished and affectionate enough to satisfy appearances. When he was gone, which was often, the house settled back into its quiet unease. Arguments, if they occurred, happened out of sight. The kind of conflict Barbara would remember later was not shouting, but waiting. Waiting for doors to close. Waiting for footsteps to fade. Waiting for attention that did not come. Barbara did not understand marriage, betrayal, or loneliness, but she understood distance. She understood when her mother's touch felt distracted. She understood when her father's voice sounded like it belonged to someone passing through rather than someone staying. Children rarely blame adults. They blame themselves. If the room felt cold, perhaps it was because she had done something wrong. If her mother seemed sad, perhaps it was because she was not enough. If her father left again, perhaps she had not made him want to stay. These thoughts did not arrive as sentences. They arrived as feelings, heavy ones, wordless ones, the kind that lodge themselves in the body and wait. On the morning of May 2nd, 1917, the house was unusually quiet. No voices carried down the halls. No servants moved about with their normal efficiency. Even the light through the windows felt wrong. Too pale. Too still. Barbara was 5 years old. She wandered through the house as children do, following instinct rather than intention. She was looking for her mother. She always was. What she found instead was a moment that would divide her life into 2 parts: before, and everything that followed. Edna Woolworth was dead. The official cause would later be listed as suffocation brought on by mastoiditis, a severe infection. There would be no autopsy in families like theirs. Explanations were often accepted not because they were convincing, but because they were convenient. Rumors spread anyway. Some whispered that Edna had taken her own life, exhausted by betrayal, isolation, and a marriage that had become unbearable. Others rejected the idea entirely. The truth dissolved quickly into uncertainty. Where it would remain, for Barbara, the truth was simpler and far more brutal. Her mother was gone. The person who should have been permanent had vanished without warning. There was no preparation, no farewell, no explanation a child could understand. Only absence, sudden and absolute. That kind of absence teaches a lesson no one intends to teach. It teaches that love can disappear overnight, that safety is temporary, that the world does not ask permission before it takes. Adults rushed in after. Voices rose. The house filled with movement and urgency. But whatever damage could be prevented at that point had already been done. The moment had entered her, after the funeral. Decisions were made quickly and efficiently. Franklin Hutton did what many men of his time did when faced with grief he could not manage and a child he did not know how to raise. He delegated. Barbara was sent away. She would grow up under the care of governesses in elite schools designed to polish children into acceptable heirs. These places were safe. They were structured. They were respectable. They were not home. Barbara moved from one institution to another, from New York to Connecticut, learning languages, manners, music, and restraint. She learned how to sit properly, how to speak softly, how to smile at the right moments. She did not learn how to be held. By the time she was old enough to recognize the pattern, it already felt normal. People arrived. People left. Stability was something you visited, not something you lived inside. Her father remained present in name and distant in practice. Letters replaced conversations. Occasional visits replaced consistency. He provided generously. He stayed emotionally absent. And the world, slowly becoming aware of her inheritance, began to pay attention, not to the child, to the fortune waiting inside her future. Barbara Hutton grew up believing this was simply how life worked, that love was unreliable, that attachment was dangerous, that survival meant adapting quickly and expecting little. These beliefs would follow her into adulthood, into marriage, into motherhood, into ruin. But for now, she was just a small girl standing at the edge of a long corridor of years, carrying a loss too large for her body to contain. The house had taught her silence. The world would soon teach her spectacle, and neither would ever truly let her go. By the time Barbara Hutton understood that her mother was not coming back, the adults around her had already begun discussing numbers, not openly, not in front of her, but money has a way of changing the air in a room. Conversations lower, decisions harden. Futures are no longer imagined. They are calculated. In 1919, when Barbara was just 7 years old, her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, died. To the public, his death marked the passing of a self-made American legend. Newspapers praised the man who had turned simple stores into a national empire, who had reshaped how ordinary people bought ordinary things, to investors and executives. It was the end of an era. To Barbara, it was the loss of someone she barely knew, but whose shadow had quietly defined her existence since birth. 5 years later, in 1924, her grandmother followed, with that second death. The Woolworth fortune condensed suddenly and irrevocably. What had once been spread across generations and branches of a family now flowed toward a single child. Barbara became the sole heir to nearly 1/3 of the Woolworth estate. At the time, it amounted to almost $30 million. Even now, the number is difficult to grasp. Adjusted for modern value, it would exceed $1 billion. In a country where most families lived paycheck to paycheck, where security meant steady work and modest savings, this inheritance was not merely wealth, it was power. Barbara did not receive the money directly. It was placed in trust, managed carefully by adults who spoke in cautious tones and treated the fortune as something both sacred and volatile. They discussed investments, interest, growth. They spoke of responsibility. No one spoke to her about choice. She was 12 years old, at that age. Children worry about friendships, approval, belonging. Barbara worried about none of those things because they had never been presented as stable options. Instead, she learned that her future was already decided, whatever she became. She would become it as an heiress. The money grew. Her father, Franklin Hutton, invested skillfully during the booming years of the 1920s. Markets rose, confidence expanded. The fortune multiplied quietly in the background of her adolescence, becoming larger and more abstract with each passing year. By the early 1930s, when Barbara would gain control of her estate, Its value had swelled beyond $50 million. The world began to notice. Teachers treated her differently. Classmates whispered. Adults measured their behavior around her with care that had nothing to do with affection. She learned, without being told, that her presence altered the expectations of a room. Attention followed her like a shadow. And attention, she would later learn, is not the same as care. While Barbara grew up within protected institutions, the world outside was changing violently. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. Prosperity shattered overnight. Banks failed, businesses closed, men stood in lines that curled around city blocks, waiting for work that did not exist. The Great Depression was not just an economic event, it was a psychological one. It stripped the country of certainty. For most Americans, the crash meant loss. For Barbara, it meant visibility. At a time when millions struggled to eat, she remained unimaginably rich. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and impossible for the public to forgive. In November 1930, just after her 18th birthday, her family hosted her debutante ball in New York City. It was extravagant beyond reason. $60,000 were spent on a single night, the equivalent of more than $1 million today. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers. Famous performers entertained. Guests wore jewels that caught the light like frozen fire. Inside, the orchestra played as if the world were still whole. Outside, the country was breaking. The press reacted with fury. Headlines condemned the excess. Columnists sharpened their language. The image of a young heiress dancing while families starved became irresistible. The public needed a symbol, and Barbara, young, beautiful, silent, was perfect. It was then that the phrase appeared, "Poor little rich girl." It spread faster than truth ever does. It carried mockery, resentment, and a strange undercurrent of pity. It reduced her to a caricature before she had spoken a single word for herself. Barbara read the headlines alone. She had not planned the ball. She had not chosen the timing. She had not caused the crash. None of that mattered. Public stories rarely require fairness, only clarity. From that moment on, she belonged to the world, not as a person, as a symbol. And symbols, once created, are difficult to escape. As the last guests left the ballroom and the lights dimmed, Barbara stepped into adulthood carrying two burdens she did not understand yet: a fortune large enough to attract anyone, and a loneliness deep enough to trust them. The country would remember that night for its extravagance. Barbara would remember it as the moment she learned that being watched was unavoidable and being understood was optional. The next chapter of her life was already waiting, and it would arrive disguised as love. By the early 1930s, Barbara Hutton had learned how to exist in public without truly being present. She moved through rooms the way she had been trained to, graceful, polite, carefully composed. She knew which fork to use, when to speak, when to smile. She understood the choreography of wealth. What she did not understand, what no one had taught her, was how to protect herself from those who saw her not as a woman, but as an opportunity. That lesson would arrive soon enough. High society in those years was international. American money flowed toward Europe, and European titles flowed toward American fortunes. The arrangement was old, familiar, and rarely innocent. Aristocratic names carried history but little cash. American heiresses carried cash but little history. Together, they created alliances that looked romantic from a distance and transactional up close. Barbara entered this world quietly, still young, still searching for something she could not name. That was when Alexis Medivani appeared. He came from a Georgian noble family displaced by revolution. Charming, impeccably dressed, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply practiced in the art of ascension. The Medivani name was already known in society circles. Alexis and his siblings had built a reputation for attaching themselves to wealth with remarkable efficiency. Alexis was handsome, confident, attentive in a way that felt intoxicating to someone who had grown up overlooked. When he looked at Barbara, he did not look through her, or at least, that is how it seemed. He spoke to her as if she were singular, as if her sadness made her interesting rather than inconvenient. He offered admiration instead of judgment, romance instead of scrutiny, to a young woman whose life had been shaped by absence and observation. This felt like rescue. Alexis was already married when they met. That detail was treated lightly in their world. Marriages dissolved as cleanly as contracts when something better appeared. And something better had appeared. Within months, Alexis divorced his wife. The speed alone should have been a warning. But warnings are only useful to people who believe they are allowed to doubt love. Barbara did not doubt. She hoped. Their courtship unfolded under the gaze of newspapers and whispers. Some praised the match. Others rolled their eyes knowingly. A rich American heiress and a titled European man. It was a story everyone thought they already understood. Barbara's advisors expressed concern. Her father remained distant. No one stopped her. Perhaps no one knew how. In June 1933, they married. The wedding was lavish. As expected, the Depression still weighed heavily on the world. But wealth continued to celebrate itself behind closed doors. Cameras flashed. Society pages filled. The public watched with the same mixture of fascination and resentment that had followed Barbara since her debut. For a brief moment, she believed she had done it. She had found stability. She had chosen love. She had escaped loneliness. Reality arrived quietly. Alexis spent money as though it were air. Jewelry appeared without discussion. Parties were hosted without restraint. Requests from his family multiplied. Barbara's fortune, vast though it was, became a resource to be tapped rather than a responsibility to be respected. At first, she did not object. Giving felt like intimacy. Paying felt like participation. She had been conditioned to equate generosity with belonging. But over time, patterns emerged. Alexis's affection cooled when money slowed. His warmth sharpened into entitlement. Conversations shifted subtly. From "we" to "you can afford it." Barbara began to notice glances exchanged behind her back. Letters requesting funds. Bills arriving without explanation. The marriage did not collapse in a dramatic argument. It eroded. This was not cruelty of violence or rage. It was the cruelty of use. By 1935, the illusion could no longer be sustained. The marriage ended in divorce. The press reacted with smug predictability. Some expressed sympathy. Many expressed satisfaction. Barbara was called naive, foolish, weak. Very few asked why a woman raised without emotional anchors might cling desperately to the first person who promised permanence. She was 23 years old, and already learning that love, when filtered through money, rarely survives intact. The end of the marriage should have been a pause, a chance to recalibrate, to heal, to learn how to be alone. Barbara did not pause. She had never learned how. The emptiness left by Alexis felt unbearable. To remain inside it would have meant facing the truth she had avoided since childhood, that love was not guaranteed, and that money could not summon it on command. So she moved forward again, quickly, toward another man, another promise, another door opening in the same long hallway. This time, the danger would not be subtle. This time, it would leave marks. Barbara did not fall into her second marriage. She stepped into it. The difference mattered, though she would not understand why until much later. In the months following her divorce from Alexis Medivani, She moved restlessly through Europe and America, unwilling to sit still long enough for disappointment to solidify into something she could not escape. To be alone felt dangerous. Silence invited memory, and memory, for Barbara, had always led back to loss. That was when she met Kurt Reventlow. He was a Danish count by marriage, tall, handsome, and carrying himself with a kind of rigid confidence that suggested strength. Where Alexis had been smooth and charming, Kurt was firm, decisive, almost severe. To a woman exhausted by being handled delicately or exploited quietly, this firmness looked like stability. It wasn't. But Barbara did not yet know how to tell the difference. Their courtship moved fast. Too fast for reflection. Too fast for doubt to catch up. Friends expressed concern. Advisors urged caution. Barbara listened politely and did nothing. In her world, speed felt like certainty. They married in 1935, scarcely a year after her first divorce. The world reacted with disbelief. Then judgment. The pattern was already forming, and people were eager to name it. Another husband, another fortune at risk, another mistake, waiting to happen. This time. The mistake would not hide behind charm. Kurt's temper surfaced early. Not explosively at first, just enough to keep her off balance. Sharp words disguised as honesty. Criticism framed as concern. Silence used as punishment. Then apologies. Followed by tenderness that felt like relief. It was a cycle Barbara recognized instinctively. Unpredictability. Affection offered and withdrawn. Love treated as something she had to earn. She mistook familiarity for fate. Soon. The volatility escalated. Kurt drank heavily. Arguments turned physical. What began as emotional pressure became outright abuse. Doors slammed. Objects shattered. Fear settled into the rooms where she slept. Barbara learned how to anticipate moods, how to soften herself, how to disappear when necessary. These were skills she had practiced since childhood, now repurposed for survival. The world outside still saw glamour. Inside, she was unraveling. It was during this marriage that her body began to turn against her. She stopped eating. At first, it felt like control, something she could manage when everything else belonged to someone else. Hunger sharpened her senses, gave her a strange clarity. Then it became a habit. Then an obsession. Then an illness. She drank to sleep. She took pills to quiet her nerves. What began as coping hardened into dependence. Her body thinned. Her strength faded. People commented on her fragility as if it were elegance. No one called it what it was. Still, life asserted itself in one undeniable way. In 1937, Barbara gave birth to a son, Lance, for the first time. Something in her life was not transactional, not conditional, not earned. The child existed simply because she existed. Photographs from that period show her holding him carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid the world might take him if she relaxed her grip. Motherhood did not heal her, but it anchored her. Kurt did not change. The marriage remained violent, unstable, suffocating. But Barbara's priorities shifted. She began to think not only of endurance, but of escape. In 1938, she divorced him. This separation was not theatrical. It was necessary. She fought for custody of Lance and won. That victory required resolve she had rarely shown before. For once, she chose something and refused to surrender it. She left Kurt behind, but the damage followed. Addiction did not end with the marriage. Anorexia did not release its grip. The habits formed in fear do not dissolve simply because the threat leaves the room. Barbara emerged from her second marriage changed. She was still young, only in her mid-20s, but she carried herself like someone far older. She had learned that love could be dangerous, that marriage could be a trap, that even wealth could not buy safety when the wrong person stood beside you. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, the hunger remained, the hunger to be chosen, the hunger to be protected, the hunger to believe that one day, love would arrive without pain attached. She had not given up. She did not know how. Outside, the world was moving toward war. Europe trembled. America watched uneasily from a distance. History was accelerating, and Barbara, bruised and searching, stood once again at the edge of a new chapter. A different city waited for her, a different man, and, for a brief moment, something that almost looked like peace. By the time Barbara Hutton left Kurt Reventlow behind, she had learned one crucial lesson, though she could not yet put it into words. Safety was not guaranteed by strength, nor by status, nor by money. She carried her son with her like a quiet vow. Lance was small, dependent, unaware of the chaos that had shaped the first years of his life. With him, Barbara felt something unfamiliar, responsibility that did not revolve around performance. For once, she was not someone's wife, someone's heiress, someone's symbol. She was simply a mother trying to keep her child close. But Europe no longer felt safe. The late 1930s were heavy with tension. Borders tightened. Conversations grew cautious. Rumors of war moved faster than facts. Barbara sensed it not through newspapers, but through the way rooms changed, the way people watched one another more closely, the way laughter came late and left early. So she went west. California was different. The light there was brighter, less ceremonial. Wealth still mattered, but it wore a looser costume. Hollywood was rising, full of ambition, reinvention, and people who had built themselves from nothing. Titles mattered less, appearances mattered more. For Barbara, it felt like breathing after years underwater. She involved herself in philanthropy, particularly as war broke out in Europe in 1939. She raised funds, hosted events, spoke publicly for causes that gave her a sense, however fragile, of usefulness. For the first time, attention felt connected to purpose rather than spectacle. The press softened. Briefly, the poor little rich girl was recast as a patriotic heiress, a woman putting her wealth to work. The narrative shifted, but the gaze never disappeared. It was during this period that she met Cary Grant. He was everything her previous husbands were not: self-made, witty, grounded, famous in his own right, yet curiously private. Born Archibald Leach in England, Grant had known poverty, instability, and reinvention. He had built his life deliberately, piece by piece. He did not need her money. That alone made him different. Their connection grew slowly, shaped by shared experiences of public life and private insecurity. Grant did not rush her. He did not overwhelm her. He treated her not as an inheritance, but as a woman whose fragility deserved respect rather than exploitation. For Barbara, the absence of pressure felt almost confusing. They married in 1942 in the middle of a world at war. The press, of course, found a way to mock it. Cash and carry, they called them, reducing the marriage to a punchline before it had time to settle into reality. But the joke missed something essential. This marriage did not drain her. It did not bruise her. It did not frighten her. Their life together was quieter, more contained. Grant was careful with her money, careful with her emotions. He did not promise salvation. He offered companionship. For a time, that was enough. Barbara still struggled. Addiction does not dissolve in the presence of kindness. Her body still bore the habits of control and escape. But for the first time, she was not actively being harmed by the person beside her. Peace, she learned, could be subtle. The marriage lasted only a few years. When it ended in 1945, it did so without scandal, without bitterness, without public wounds. Grant walked away without touching her fortune, a rare act in her life that spoke louder than any declaration of love. They remained friends. That fact alone made the marriage different from all the others. But even gentle endings are still endings. Barbara emerged from the union older, wiser, and quietly aware of something painful, even when love arrived without cruelty. It did not stay, and perhaps, she feared, it never would. She was in her early 30s now, still wealthy, still famous, still searching. The world, meanwhile, was changing again. The war ended. Europe rebuilt. Glamour returned, stitched together from rubble and nostalgia. And once more, Barbara felt the pull of old patterns, old continents, old titles, old promises dressed in new clothes. She had survived violence. She had tasted kindness. What she had not learned, what she would continue to struggle with, was how to stop believing that the next door might finally lead to a room where nothing would be taken from her. The hallway stretched on, and Barbara, carrying hope like a habit she could not break, stepped forward once more. After the war, the world rushed to feel alive again. Cities rebuilt their facades. Ballrooms reopened. Champagne flowed with a kind of urgency, as if celebration itself were a defense against memory. Europe, bruised and exhausted, welcomed American money the way dry land welcomes rain. Titles that had survived bombs and borders now needed cash to survive peace. Barbara returned to Europe carrying all the contradictions she had never resolved. She was still young enough to be admired, still rich enough to be desired, and still wounded enough to believe that love might arrive if she simply chose better this time. The years with Cary Grant had shown her that gentleness was possible, but they had not taught her how to live without needing someone else to define the shape of her days. Loneliness, once familiar, had become intolerable. It was in this post-war shimmer that she met Prince Igor Trubetskoy. He was aristocratic without being theatrical, charming without excess, a French nobleman of Russian descent. Igor embodied the romantic residue of old Europe, polished, athletic, ambitious. Unlike Alexis, he did not appear predatory. Unlike Kurt, he did not radiate threat. He seemed normal. Igor was also a racing driver. The sport had emerged from the war with new energy. Engines were faster. Crowds were larger. Speed promised renewal. To race was to defy recent history, to move forward violently and without apology. Barbara was drawn to that defiance. They married in 1947. Once again, newspapers followed her with weary fascination. The pattern was familiar now. Rich American heiress, European title, whispered calculations. But Barbara had grown skilled at ignoring the commentary. She believed this marriage was different. In some ways, it was. Igor did not dominate her. He did not terrorize her. But he did require funding. Racing was expensive. Cars, teams, travel. Ambition had a price. And Barbara paid it willingly. Supporting his dreams felt meaningful, necessary, like partnership. Money moved quietly, steadily, out of her accounts. She told herself this was love. By 1951, the marriage ended. Not explosively, not tragically, just empty. Another door closed without ceremony. Another hope expired without drama. Barbara was no longer shocked by endings. She was simply tired. The exhaustion settled deeper this time. Years of malnutrition, alcohol, and medication had thinned her resilience. Her body felt older than her age. Her mind moved between clarity and fog. Doctors expressed concern in careful tones. In the early 1950s, she attempted to take her own life. The act was private, desperate, quiet. It was not a plea for attention. It was a search for silence. But silence, once again, refused her. She survived. The press did not offer mercy. The nickname returned with renewed cruelty. Poor little rich girl, as if suffering were proof of incompetence, as if pain were a punchline when money sat nearby. Barbara withdrew. She moved through Europe like a ghost of her former self, still housed beautifully, still surrounded by staff, still capable of buying comfort without relief. The illusion of endless wealth began to fracture. Divorce settlements, generosity, maintenance of multiple estates, it all accumulated. Fortunes. She learned too late. Do not disappear loudly, they fade. And yet, even now, she did not stop believing in marriage. In 1953, she married Porfirio Rubirosa. He was dazzling, a Dominican diplomat and legendary playboy. Rubirosa had a reputation that preceded him. He moved through high society like a man who understood desire as currency. His charm was precise, practiced, irresistible to those who wanted intensity more than safety. He had already been married to another American heiress, Doris Duke, and had walked away from that union financially enriched. Everyone knew the story. Barbara married him anyway. The marriage lasted 53 days. In that brief span, money flowed, gifts were demanded, travel was extravagant. The illusion collapsed almost immediately. When it ended, Rubirosa left with a generous settlement and a reputation reinforced. The humiliation cut deeply. This was not tragedy stretched over years. This was spectacle compressed into weeks. The press feasted. The public laughed. Barbara endured. Her health continued to decline. She married again in 1955 to Baron Gottfried von Cramm, a German tennis champion admired for his dignity and restraint. This marriage lasted longer than the others. It was calmer, kinder. But even calm could not undo decades of damage. They divorced in 1959, quietly, almost politely. One final marriage followed in the 1960s. By then, hope no longer burned brightly. It flickered, habitually. Marriage had become less a dream than a reflex, a gesture repeated so often it felt safer than stopping. When that marriage ended too, something in Barbara finally gave way. Not dramatically, just completely. The world had changed. Fashion, culture, values, all moved on. And Barbara, once the embodiment of modern wealth, now felt out of step with time itself. Her fortune had thinned. Her health had weakened. Her spirit had retreated. Only one thing still anchored her: her son, Lance, and even that anchor would not hold forever. Lance had always existed at the center of Barbara's life in a way nothing else ever had. Not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, like a quiet weight that kept her from drifting too far from herself. He had grown up much as she had, surrounded by comfort, educated in the finest schools, guided by staff more often than by hands that loved him daily. Barbara did not know how to mother in ordinary ways. Her own childhood had given her no map for constancy, but she loved him with the kind of devotion she understood best: protective, anxious, absolute, in him. She saw both redemption and continuation, the chance to give what she had never received, the fear of repeating what she could not escape. As Lance entered adulthood, he carried the contradictions of his inheritance. He was privileged, restless, charming, and drawn to speed, perhaps unconsciously echoing the men who had passed through his mother's life. He flew planes. He chased exhilaration. He moved as if still trying to outrun something unnamed. Barbara worried. But she had always worried. Fear had long since become her native language. By the early 1970s, her world had narrowed. Her health deteriorated steadily. Years of anorexia had weakened her organs. Alcohol and prescription drugs, once tools for coping, had become necessities. Her eyesight failed. Pain became a daily companion. She no longer moved easily through society. The parties faded. The invitations slowed. Her name still carried weight, but it belonged to another era now, an era the world was done romanticizing. Then, in 1972, the unthinkable happened. Lance died in a plane crash. The news arrived like an erasure. For Barbara, this was not merely another loss. It was the loss that reordered all others. Husbands had left. Money had drained away. Reputation had turned cruel. But the death of a child collapses the future itself. There was nothing left to negotiate with. She did not scream. She did not dramatize her grief. She withdrew completely. Those who saw her in the months afterward remarked on her stillness. The way her body seemed to fold inward, as if conserving what little life remained. With Lance gone, the last reason to endure dissolved. She sold properties, closed houses, let go of places she had once believed might save her. Each sale was quiet, practical, and final. Grandeur peeled away layer by layer, until what remained was not poverty, but simplicity enforced by exhaustion. In the mid-1970s, Barbara moved into the penthouse of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. A hotel is a place without history. That appealed to her. There were no memories in the walls, no echoes of failed marriages, no rooms haunted by absence. Staff came and went. Services were handled without explanation. The city existed below her, distant and manageable. Her days became hushed. She slept often, listened more than she spoke, moved slowly, guided by familiarity rather than sight. Pills lined the bedside table. Curtains filtered the light. Silence became a kind of shelter. Visitors were few. The world still remembered her name, but it no longer needed her. And Barbara no longer needed the world. Fame had lost its meaning. Wealth had lost its power. Even grief had settled into something quieter, less sharp, more absolute. In the final years, she was nearly blind. She spent hours listening to the city breathe beneath her windows, the sound constant and unreachable. Sometimes she spoke to no one at all. Sometimes she addressed Lance aloud, as if sound alone might bridge the distance death had created. On May 11th, 1979, Barbara Hutton died. She was 66 years old. The press reported the end of the poor little rich girl. They summarized her life and marriages, fortunes lost, scandals endured. They spoke of excess, of waste, of tragedy softened into legend. What they did not say, what they never quite understood, was that Barbara Hutton had not failed because she was rich. She had suffered because she was alone too early, too often, and too completely. Her story was never about money. It was about a child who learned, at 5 years old, that love could vanish without warning, and spent the rest of her life trying to make it stay. High above Wilshire Boulevard, the city continues to murmur, and somewhere in that sound lives the quiet truth of a woman the world watched endlessly, yet never truly heard. After Barbara Hutton died, the world did what it always does when a complicated life ends. It simplified. Newspapers reduced her to numbers. 7 marriages, billions inherited, millions lost, a fortune squandered. A cautionary tale wrapped in satin and tragedy. The nickname appeared again, as if it were a factual conclusion rather than a lazy refrain. The poor little rich girl. It fit neatly into a headline. It required no empathy, and it allowed distance. From the outside, Barbara's life looked like excess followed by collapse. A woman who had been given everything and somehow managed to lose it all, to many. That loss felt deserved, almost comforting. It reassured the public that money did not guarantee happiness, that wealth itself carried a moral cost. But that version of her story missed something essential. Barbara Hutton did not spend her life chasing luxury. Luxury chased her. It arrived before she could refuse it, before she could even understand it. She did not choose abundance any more than she chose the absence that followed her childhood. What she chased, again and again, was something far less dramatic. She chased permanence. She wanted what most people take for granted without ever naming. A sense that someone would stay, that affection would not need to be earned, that love, once offered, would not be withdrawn as punishment or payment. Every marriage was an attempt to answer the same question she had carried since she was 5 years old. If I give enough, will you remain? Men mistook her generosity for weakness. The public mistook her vulnerability for foolishness. History mistook her pain for spectacle. In truth, Barbara was not reckless with money because she did not value it. She was reckless because money was the only language she had been taught to speak fluently. It was how care was expressed in her world. It was how attention was measured. It was how belonging was negotiated. She gave because giving had once meant survival. The tragedy is not that she lost her fortune. The tragedy is that she never learned how to protect herself without trading pieces of her life in return. When people speak of Barbara Hutton now, they often do so with a kind of detached fascination, as if her life were a museum exhibit, beautiful, broken, safely behind glass, but lived from the inside. Her story was not theatrical. It was repetitive, quietly desperate, painfully human. Loss did not arrive once and destroy her. It arrived early and then kept arriving. A mother gone without explanation, a father who never stayed, husbands who took more than they gave, a body that learned to hurt itself to feel in control, a son who became the last reason to endure, and then was taken too, by the time she reached the end. Barbara was not asking for redemption or understanding. She was simply tired. In the penthouse above Wilshire Boulevard, stripped of spectacle, nearly blind, medicated into quiet. She was closer to herself than she had ever been. The city no longer demanded performance. The world no longer expected anything from her. And in that stillness, something honest remained. Not wealth, not legacy, not scandal, just a life shaped by early absence and prolonged longing. Barbara Hutton's story endures not because she was rich, but because she was unprotected in a world that assumed money was armor. It endures because it reveals an uncomfortable truth Americans rarely like to face. That success does not heal abandonment. That privilege does not erase grief. And that childhood wounds, if left unspoken, do not fade with time. They simply find new places to live. Her life asks a question we still struggle to answer. What happens when a child grows up with everything, except the one thing that teaches them how to feel safe? The world answered her with laughter, judgment, and headlines. History may yet answer her more gently, but only if we are willing to listen past the nickname, past the money, past the myth, and hear the quiet voice of a girl who never stopped hoping that someone, someday, would finally stay. There is a particular kind of violence that comes from being visible your entire life. Not the violence of fists or weapons, but the quieter kind, the constant awareness of being watched, measured, interpreted. For Barbara Hutton, this began long before she could speak for herself. By the time she learned to read, the world had already decided who she was supposed to be. An heiress, a symbol, a spectacle. Every choice she made was treated as evidence. Every failure was amplified. Every attempt to begin again was greeted with knowing smiles and sharpened pens. She was never allowed the anonymity that makes mistakes survivable. Other women married the wrong men and were forgotten. Barbara married the wrong men and became a lesson. The press did not follow her because she was interesting. They followed her because she was useful. Her life allowed the public to rehearse its anxieties about wealth, morality, and femininity without confronting its own complicity. She was proof, they said, that money corrupted, proof that privilege was hollow, proof that excess led inevitably to ruin. What they rarely acknowledged was how early the narrative began, and how little room it left her to change. Once you are cast as a character, growth looks like contradiction, healing looks like weakness, privacy looks like guilt. Barbara learned this the hard way. When she withdrew, she was called reclusive. When she married again, she was called foolish. When she gave generously, she was called reckless. When she tried to die, she was called dramatic. There was no version of her behavior that did not confirm the story already written, in quieter moments. Those close to her noticed something else. A woman who listened more than she spoke, who remembered small details, who gave without calculation, who seemed genuinely startled by kindness, as if it were an accident rather than a rule. But kindness did not photograph well. It did not sell papers. It did not fit inside a nickname. So it vanished from the record. Barbara's wealth, even in decline, remained substantial. But wealth isolates as much as it protects. It warps relationships. It attracts people with needs that have nothing to do with affection. Over time, she learned to suspect every gesture, every compliment, every declaration of concern. This suspicion did not make her safer. It made her lonelier. Trust, once broken early and often, does not return easily. And for Barbara, trust had never been whole to begin with. She wanted closeness desperately. But closeness required belief, and belief had been punished too many times. So she oscillated between openness and retreat, between hope and resignation, between wanting to be seen and wanting to disappear. Her body mirrored this conflict. Anorexia offered control where life had not. Addiction offered relief where endurance had failed. These were not indulgences. They were strategies, flawed, destructive strategies, but strategies nonetheless. Ways to survive a world that never stopped asking her to perform. By the end, she was exhausted not just by loss, but by explanation. She had spent decades watching others explain her life back to her, flattening complexity into certainty. When she no longer corrected them, it was not surrender, it was relief. The city below her penthouse continued to glow each night, indifferent and persistent. New fortunes were made, new scandals erupted, new names replaced hers in headlines. The world moved on, as it always does. Barbara did not. Her life had slowed to the pace of breath and memory. The past no longer arrived in sharp images, but in sensations, a tightening in the chest, a familiar ache, a sense of waiting for something that would not come in those final years. She was not thinking about money or reputation. She was thinking about moments, about what had been missing between them. If there was regret, it was not about excess. It was about how little protection she had been given when she needed it most. How many decisions she had made while still trying to repair a childhood wound no adult had helped her name. Barbara Hutton's life is often told as a story of loss measured in dollars. But the real cost was emotional. It was the cost of being known without being understood, of being envied without being protected, of being visible without being held. That cost cannot be calculated. It can only be felt. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate, not as a tale of wealth squandered, but as a mirror held up to a culture that mistakes attention for care and spectacle for truth. Barbara Hutton was never asking to be admired. She was asking to be safe, and in a world that only knew how to watch her. That request went unanswered. When the attention finally moved elsewhere, it did not feel like freedom. It felt like emptiness. For most of her life, Barbara Hutton had existed inside a constant hum of expectation. Even when she withdrew, the world remained just outside the door, waiting, speculating, ready to re-enter the moment she made a move. Silence, when it arrived at last, was not peaceful. It was unfamiliar, almost frightening. She had lived so long as a story told by others that she was unsure who she was without narration. In the penthouse of the Beverly Wilshire, days passed without shape. Morning and evening blurred together. Time was measured not by appointments or invitations, but by medication schedules and the slow shift of light across the room. There was no audience anymore. No one was asking her to be anything, and in that absence of demand, something honest surfaced. Barbara did not think of herself as tragic. That word belonged to spectators. From the inside, her life felt less like a single catastrophe and more like erosion, a steady wearing away of certainty, trust, and expectation. She had not expected perfection. She had expected continuity. Someone who stayed, someone who did not need convincing, someone who would not leave when the novelty wore off. Those expectations were never unreasonable. They were simply unmet. If there was bitterness, it was muted. If there was anger, it had burned out years earlier. What remained was a kind of quiet reckoning, a gradual understanding that the damage done in childhood had shaped every choice that followed. Barbara had not been reckless because she was careless. She had been reckless because she was hopeful. Hope, without guidance, can become dangerous. It drives people toward repetition, toward familiar pain dressed as possibility. She had mistaken intensity for love, presence for permanence, attention for care. No one had taught her otherwise. In her final months, those close to her noticed that she spoke less about the past and more about nothing at all. Long silences did not bother her anymore. They felt earned. She no longer filled space for the comfort of others. Sometimes she listened to music softly, not for pleasure, but for company. Sometimes she sat by the window and let the city's distant sound wash over her, a reminder that life continued even when she could no longer participate in it. She did not romanticize her suffering. She accepted it. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died quietly. There were no dramatic final words, no reconciliation with the world that had watched her so closely, just a body that had grown tired of carrying history. The obituaries came quickly. They listed her marriages. They counted her losses. They measured her fortune at its peak and at its end. They told a story that made sense to readers. What they could not list was the accumulation of small moments that had defined her life far more than headlines ever did. The waiting, the hoping, the repeated belief that the next beginning would finally hold. Those things do not fit neatly into columns. Barbara Hutton is often remembered as an anomaly, proof that wealth fails, that privilege corrupts, that excess leads to ruin. But that reading is comfortable because it places the cause outside ourselves. It allows us to believe that her suffering was exceptional. It wasn't. Strip away the money, the titles, the spectacle, and what remains is painfully ordinary. A child who lost her mother too early, grew up without emotional shelter, and spent her life trying to recreate what she never received. Her story does not warn against riches. It warns against neglect, against raising children without teaching them how to feel safe, how to trust wisely, how to recognize love that does not demand payment. In the end, Barbara Hutton did not fail to live up to her fortune. Her fortune failed to protect her from the one thing it was never designed to fix: loneliness. And when the city lights dimmed below her final window, what remained of her life was not scandal or extravagance, but a simple, unresolved truth. That being given everything does not prepare you for losing the one thing you needed most. The world moved on. Her story stayed, quietly asking the same question it always had. Not how much she had, but what she was missing. If Barbara Hutton's life teaches anything, it is not that wealth is meaningless, but that it is incomplete. Money can build walls, but it cannot teach you what to do inside them. It can attract people, but it cannot tell you why they stay. It can erase inconvenience, but it cannot erase fear. From the outside, Barbara's life looked like a long series of opportunities squandered. From the inside, it felt like a continuous attempt to arrive at a place where she could finally rest without being abandoned. What the world called excess, she experienced as insurance against being left, insurance against silence, insurance against the moment when everyone else would decide she was no longer worth the effort. Each house she bought was not a trophy, but a hope. Each marriage was not foolishness, but a wager. Each gift was not extravagance, but a question asked without words. Is this enough for you to stay? The tragedy is not that the answer was always no. The tragedy is that no one taught her how to ask a different question. Barbara was raised in a world that trained her to manage wealth before it taught her how to manage attachment. She learned etiquette before intimacy, image before boundaries, giving before discernment. By the time she understood that love does not require payment, she had already spent most of her life paying for it. Her story unsettles people because it disrupts a comforting belief that suffering is proportional to scarcity, that pain belongs primarily to those who lack material security. Barbara's life refuses that logic. She had abundance and still lived in emotional poverty. That contradiction made people uncomfortable. It still does. So they reduced her to a symbol instead of confronting the deeper implication. That neglect, instability, and early loss shape a person more powerfully than privilege ever can. Barbara did not need more money. She needed consistency. She needed protection when she was small. She needed someone to teach her that love does not disappear when you disappoint it. She never received those lessons, and without them, Every adult choice she made was an attempt to compensate for what childhood had withheld in the years after her death. Biographers debated numbers, how much she inherited, how much she lost, who took what, who stayed loyal, who exploited her. Those details matter, but not as much as the pattern beneath them. A girl who lost her mother at 5. A girl whose father sent her away. A girl who learned that affection was conditional and temporary. That girl grew up. She married men who mirrored instability because instability felt familiar. She mistook intensity for connection because calm had never been modeled. She gave too much because she believed that being indispensable was the same as being loved. None of this makes her foolish. It makes her human. Barbara Hutton's life does not belong in the category of moral lessons about money. It belongs in the quieter, more uncomfortable category of stories about unmet emotional needs and how far they can echo when left unattended. When the lights finally went out in her penthouse above Wilshire Boulevard, the city did not notice. It rarely does. But the silence she left behind carries something worth listening to. A reminder that children do not need perfect parents, but they do need present ones. That wealth can delay pain, but it cannot dissolve it. That being admired is not the same as being cared for, and that sometimes the most dangerous belief a person can carry is the belief that enough will eventually arrive from the outside. Barbara Hutton spent her life searching for enough. In the end, what she needed was never something money could buy. It was something that should have been given freely. Long before she ever learned what she was worth. There is a moment in every life when patterns become visible. For some people, it arrives early, accompanied by guidance and correction. For others, it arrives late, after damage has already been done, after repetition has hardened into habit. For Barbara Hutton, that moment came slowly, diluted by privilege and obscured by noise. By the time she recognized the shape of her own life, she had already lived most of it inside the same loop. Loss followed by hope. Hope followed by disappointment. Disappointment followed by another attempt to begin again, from the outside. This looked like instability. From the inside, it felt like momentum, because stopping would have meant facing the original wound without distraction. Childhood does not disappear when we grow up. It waits. It waits in the way we choose partners, in the way we respond to conflict, in the way we interpret silence. Barbara's childhood had taught her that love was fragile and conditional, that adults could vanish without warning, and that safety was never guaranteed. Those lessons did not fade with time. They became the lens through which she understood the world when people entered her life. She did not ask whether they were trustworthy. She asked whether they were willing to stay when they demanded too much. She gave more when they withdrew. She panicked when they left. She blamed herself. This was not weakness. It was training. She had been trained, unintentionally, to believe that abandonment was normal and that survival depended on adaptation rather than expectation. She did not grow up believing she was entitled to care. She grew up believing care had to be secured. So she secured it the only way she knew how. With money, with access, with generosity that bordered on self-erasure. Her wealth amplified this dynamic rather than correcting it. Money made it possible for people to remain without ever committing. It blurred the line between affection and convenience. It ensured that no one ever had to prove why they were there. And Barbara, deprived of emotional reference points, struggled to tell the difference. There were moments, quiet ones, often ignored by history, when she came close to understanding this. After her divorce from Cary Grant, for example, she recognized something rare, a relationship that ended without exploitation, a man who left without taking, a bond that did not collapse into cruelty. That marriage did not last, but it left behind a faint imprint of possibility, for a time. She carried it with her, but possibility requires reinforcement. Without it, old instincts return. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. And so Barbara drifted back toward what she knew, toward intensity, toward need, toward people who required her to give rather than simply exist. Each repetition reinforced the belief that stability was temporary and that love, when it arrived, would inevitably come at a cost. By the 1950s, her body had begun to register what her mind could not resolve. Anorexia stripped her down physically in the same way abandonment had stripped her emotionally. It reduced the world to something she could manage: hunger, discipline, control. Addiction softened the edges of anxiety, dulled memory, and offered brief escape from the constant vigilance that had defined her inner life. These were not moral failings. They were adaptations, destructive ones, but adaptations nonetheless. Barbara did not wake up one morning and decide to disappear. She slowly learned that disappearing felt safer than hoping. She learned that numbness hurt less than expectation. She learned that control over her body was easier than control over relationships. By the time her son Lance died, these adaptations had become her only remaining structure. His death did not introduce new pain. It collapsed the last defense against the pain that had always been there. After that, she no longer sought rescue. She no longer chased beginnings. She endured, and endurance, without hope, is a quiet kind of suffering. People often ask what Barbara Hutton's life means, what lesson it offers, what conclusion can be drawn. But lives like hers resist tidy interpretation. They do not exist to instruct. They exist to reveal. Her life reveals how profoundly early loss shapes adult behavior, how privilege can delay self-awareness rather than prevent damage, how easily a wounded child can grow into a wounded adult when no one intervenes in time. Barbara Hutton did not need saving. She needed teaching. She needed witnessing. She needed someone to say, early and often, "You are safe. You do not need to earn this." No amount of money ever told her that, and so she spent a lifetime searching for it in places where it could not be found. The shadow of her childhood followed her to the end, not as a memory, but as a presence, quiet, persistent, unrelenting, and in that shadow, her life unfolded exactly as it had been shaped to do. There is a point at which hope stops being a belief and becomes a reflex. For Barbara Hutton, that point arrived quietly, somewhere between her third marriage and her fifth. By then, she no longer believed that happiness would last, but she still reached for it automatically, the way one reaches for a light switch in a dark room, even after learning the power is gone. Hope had become muscle memory. Each new beginning followed the same internal script. This time will be different, not because the circumstances were different, but because she needed them to be. To stop hoping would have meant confronting the truth she had spent decades avoiding, that no external arrangement could repair what had been broken internally. So she repeated the gesture. Marriage, relocation, reinvestment, emotional, and financial. Each repetition carried less innocence and more fatigue. The optimism thinned, replaced by urgency. She was no longer searching for joy. She was searching for relief. People often misunderstand repetition in wounded lives. They assume it signals stupidity or stubbornness. In reality, repetition is often an attempt at mastery. A person returns to the same scenario, again and again, hoping unconsciously to achieve a different ending. to finally gain control over an outcome that once arrived without consent. Barbara was trying to rewrite her first loss. If she could make someone stay this time, perhaps the past would loosen its grip. If she could be chosen without conditions, perhaps her childhood would be redeemed. But the past does not negotiate. By the late 1950s, even her social circle began to shrink, not because people stopped caring, but because they no longer knew how to help. Barbara's wealth created distance. Her fame created caution. Her fragility created discomfort. Friends did not know whether to intervene or step back. Advisors focused on finances, not feelings. Doctors treated symptoms rather than origins. Everyone addressed fragments. No one addressed the whole. Barbara learned to present herself as manageable. She did not cry publicly. She did not rage. She did not demand explanation. She smiled when appropriate. She thanked people for concern. She retreated when overwhelmed. The chaos that had once defined her relationships turned inward. And inward chaos is easier to ignore. As the years passed, she became skilled at minimizing her own needs. She framed exhaustion as age, sadness as temperament, addiction as necessity. To admit vulnerability openly would have invited scrutiny she could no longer endure. So she grew quieter. The world interpreted this as eccentricity. It was self-preservation. Barbara's final marriages were not driven by passion so much as inertia. Marriage had become a familiar structure, something to lean against when standing alone felt impossible. Even when affection was minimal, the presence of another person delayed the confrontation with solitude. But solitude arrived anyway. It always does. By the time she moved permanently into the Beverly, Wilshire penthouse, Barbara no longer believed that companionship would save her. She accepted that part of her life had ended, even if her body had not yet followed. What surprised her was how little drama accompanied that acceptance. There was no single moment of clarity, no epiphany, just a gradual softening of expectation. A willingness to let days pass without demanding that they lead anywhere. For the first time since childhood, she was not trying to fix the past. She was simply surviving the present. In that survival, there was a strange kind of dignity. Barbara did not attempt to rebrand herself. She did not seek late-life redemption through philanthropy or public confession. She did not write memoirs to correct the record. She did not defend herself against history. She let the story be told without her. This silence was not defeat. It was exhaustion mixed with acceptance. She had spent decades explaining herself to people who were never listening for nuance. She no longer saw the point. What remained of her energy was reserved for the smallest, most basic acts: waking, eating when she could, taking medication, sitting by the window, listening to the city breathe. In these moments, stripped of ambition and performance, Barbara was closest to peace she had ever been. Not happiness. Peace. Peace does not require optimism. It requires surrender. She had surrendered the hope that the world would change. She had surrendered the need to be understood. She had surrendered the fantasy that love would arrive in a form she could recognize without pain attached. What she had not surrendered, what remained until the end, was the quiet awareness of how her life had been shaped. She knew now that her choices were not random, that her suffering was not moral failure, that her repetition was not foolishness, but grief seeking resolution. This knowledge did not save her, but it softened the final years. When Barbara Hutton died, she did not leave behind a triumphant legacy or a cautionary scandal. She left behind a life that asked difficult questions about childhood, about wealth, about the cost of being admired without being protected. Those questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is the point. Some stories are not meant to resolve. They are meant to linger, quietly, uncomfortably, like a truth we recognize but would rather not face. Barbara Hutton's life was one of those stories. Not loud, not heroic, but deeply, painfully human. Every inheritance comes in two forms. There is the one written in legal documents, numbers, properties, trusts, signatures witnessed and filed away. And then there is the inheritance that never appears on paper. The one passed silently, absorbed rather than explained, felt rather than acknowledged. Barbara Hutton received both. The first was vast, historic, and visible to the world. The second was quieter, more enduring, and infinitely more costly. She inherited wealth. She inherited abandonment, and the second shaped her far more completely than the first. From the moment her mother died, Barbara inherited uncertainty. She inherited the knowledge that love could vanish without warning, that safety was temporary, that the people meant to protect you might disappear when you needed them most. No fortune ever countered that lesson. In fact, her fortune reinforced it. Her fortune. Because money attracted presence without commitment. People arrived easily. They stayed selectively. They left without consequence to themselves. For Barbara, every departure reopened the same wound. The wound never healed because it was never treated at its source. As she moved through adulthood, her relationships replayed the same structure. Men entered her life with confidence and charm. They promised stability, excitement, purpose, and gradually, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, they revealed the cost of staying. Affection became conditional. Peace became negotiable. Safety became something she had to purchase. Each time, Barbara adjusted. She gave more. She endured longer. She explained away behavior that would have driven others to leave sooner, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked reference. No one had modeled healthy attachment for her. In families where emotional security exists, children grow up knowing what to expect from love. They recognize warning signs. They trust their instincts when something feels wrong. Barbara did not have that luxury. Her instincts had been shaped in chaos, and chaos, when familiar, feels like home. This is why her story cannot be reduced to poor judgment or extravagance. Those explanations are too shallow. Barbara was not chasing pleasure. She was chasing regulation, an emotional equilibrium she had never been taught to maintain. Her wealth made it possible to avoid consequences, but it also made it impossible to encounter honest resistance. No one needed to say no to her. No one needed to challenge her patterns. There was always a way to smooth things over with money. So the cycle continued unchecked. It is tempting to believe that someone so wealthy could have chosen differently at any moment, that freedom was always available to her. But freedom requires knowledge. Choice requires clarity, and clarity rarely develops in isolation. Barbara lived surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. Advisors managed her finances. Doctors managed her symptoms. Friends admired her resilience. Husbands consumed her resources. No one was tasked with protecting her inner life. That responsibility was never assigned. By the time society began to speak more openly about trauma, attachment, and emotional development, Barbara was already deep into adulthood, her patterns entrenched, her coping mechanisms destructive but familiar. She did not have the language to describe what she felt. She only knew the sensation, a persistent unease, a feeling of being unmoored, a fear that any moment of calm was temporary. This fear drove her decisions far more than greed or vanity ever did. when she married again after Cary Grant. It was not because she believed she had found something better. It was because being alone felt like returning to the moment after her mother's death, when the house fell silent and nothing felt anchored. Marriage, even flawed marriage, delayed that silence. The inheritance no one counts is the one that shapes our nervous system, the one that teaches us what to expect from the world. Barbara inherited vigilance. She inherited longing. She inherited the belief that love must be earned repeatedly or it would be withdrawn. She spent her life trying to disprove that belief. She never succeeded. By the time she reached the final decades of her life, Barbara was no longer fighting these patterns. She was living inside their consequences. Her body bore the evidence. Her finances reflected years of emotional decision-making. Her isolation was the natural outcome of a life spent negotiating safety rather than building it. Yet even in this, there was no bitterness. Barbara did not rage against her past. She did not curse her parents or indict the world. She accepted her life the way one accepts weather, something that happens, something you endure, something you adapt to. This acceptance was not wisdom earned easily. It was resignation shaped by fatigue. Still, within it lay a quiet truth that her life had not been wasted. It had been spent responding to an inheritance no one acknowledged, but which governed everything she did. And in recognizing that, even late, Barbara reclaimed a piece of herself the world had never noticed. Not the heiress, not the spectacle, but the child who had learned too early that love does not always stay, and who never stopped trying to make it stay anyway. There is something especially cruel about a life lived without witnesses, not without people. Barbara Hutton was almost never alone in that sense, but without anyone who truly saw her, who understood the continuity of her story rather than its headlines, who recognized that each chapter was not an isolated failure, but a continuation of an unresolved beginning. Barbara was surrounded by observers, not witnesses. Observers take notes. Witnesses hold context. The world observed her relentlessly. It tracked her marriages, her spending, her appearance, her decline. But no one stayed long enough, or close enough, to understand how one moment flowed into the next. This absence of witness shaped her final decades more than any single loss. After Lance's death, people spoke softly around her, as though grief were a fragile object that might shatter if handled directly. They avoided asking questions. They avoided naming the devastation. Silence returned, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of avoidance. Barbara had known this silence before. It was the same silence that filled the house after her mother died, the same silence that followed her father's decision to send her away. The same silence that crept in after each marriage ended, when sympathy dried up and curiosity took its place. Silence, she had learned, was what followed when pain made others uncomfortable. So she stopped speaking about it. In her later years, Barbara's conversations became practical, restrained, almost minimal. She discussed logistics, arrangements, schedules. When people asked how she was, she answered politely. She did not burden them with truth. Truth, she had learned, was rarely welcomed. Her isolation was not dramatic. It did not look like despair. It looked like narrowing. Fewer rooms, fewer relationships, fewer expectations. Her life contracted until it could be managed without disappointment. The penthouse suited this contraction. Hotels offer a particular kind of anonymity. They provide service without intimacy, presence without obligation. Staff come and go without asking personal questions. There is no expectation of reciprocity. For Barbara, this arrangement felt safer than private homes ever had. Nothing in a hotel belongs to you completely, and nothing can be taken away unexpectedly. She arranged her days around routine, medication at set times, meals when she could tolerate them, long stretches of sitting, listening, thinking. Her body dictated the pace now. The urgency that had once driven her decisions was gone. In its place was something quieter, awareness. She became acutely aware of how little most people understand about suffering that does not announce itself loudly, how easily pain is dismissed when it coexists with comfort, how quickly empathy evaporates when envy enters the picture. Barbara had lived long enough to see herself become an artifact, a reference point, a story told in shorthand. She understood that this transformation was irreversible, and she no longer resisted it. Resistance requires energy. Energy requires belief that something better is possible. Barbara's belief had not vanished, but it had changed. She no longer believed that the world would see her differently. She believed only that she could see herself more clearly. In this clarity, she began to recognize the through line of her life not as failure, but as consistency. She had been consistent in her longing, consistent in her generosity, consistent in her hope, even when hope harmed her. This consistency did not redeem the outcomes, but it explained them, and explanation, even without absolution, brought relief. Barbara did not forgive the world. She did not condemn it either. She understood that most people were acting from their own unexamined wounds, just as she had. The difference was that hers had been amplified by wealth and exposure. Fame does not create pain, it magnifies it. By the time she reached the end, Barbara was no longer interested in being understood by strangers. She had accepted that her life would be summarized inaccurately and repeatedly. What mattered was that she understood herself. That understanding arrived late, but it arrived. She saw now that her life had been shaped less by bad luck than by unmet needs, that her choices were not random, but patterned, that her suffering was not mysterious, but traceable. She did not regret loving. She regretted not being protected long enough to learn how to love safely in the final stretch of her life. This realization did not spark transformation. There was no dramatic reinvention. It simply softened the narrative she carried inside herself. She stopped asking, "What did I do wrong?" She began asking, "What did I never receive?" That question did not demand an answer. It offered context, and context, at last, gave her something the world never had: understanding without judgment. Barbara Hutton died without witnesses to her inner life. But she did not die unaware, and that awareness, quiet, late, incomplete, was perhaps the closest thing to peace she had ever known. By the end of her life, Barbara Hutton had learned a truth few people ever articulate. Loss is not a single event. It is an accumulation. It gathers slowly, almost politely, over years. Each absence adds weight. Each disappointment shifts balance. Each unacknowledged grief alters the equation until one day the sum feels heavier than the body carrying it. Barbara understood this not intellectually, but physically. Her body kept score. Years of malnutrition had weakened her bones and organs. Alcohol and medication blurred the edges of pain but also thinned the line between presence and absence. Her eyesight failed gradually, as if the world itself were withdrawing in sympathy. Doctors spoke in careful, measured tones, offering management rather than hope. There was no miracle left to pursue. Barbara did not resent this. By then, she had stopped expecting life to correct itself. Expectation, she had learned, was a liability instead. She lived within the arithmetic of what remained, a small circle of staff, a few carefully chosen routines, memories that surfaced without warning and receded just as quickly. She had lost the desire to explain herself, but she had not lost the ability to observe. From her chair by the window, she watched the city continue, ambitious, indifferent, endlessly renewing itself. New wealth rose, new names replaced old ones. The machinery of success did not pause for reflection. It never does, in quieter moments. Barbara noticed how often people confuse endurance with strength. They praised her for surviving marriages, scandals, addiction, public ridicule. Survival, in their telling, was evidence of resilience. But endurance is not the same as healing. Endurance simply means you stayed alive. Barbara had endured because she had no alternative. Healing requires support, context, and safety, things she had rarely been given. To survive without them had required an enormous, invisible effort. She did not romanticize that effort. She understood its cost. In the absence of witnesses, she became her own archivist. She revisited her life not as a series of mistakes, but as a chain of cause and effect. She traced lines backward, from her final isolation to her son's death. From her son's death to her second marriage. From that marriage to her first. From her first to her debut. From her debut to her childhood. From her childhood to a locked bedroom door in 1917. The line was unbroken. This realization did not bring joy. It brought coherence. And coherence, after a lifetime of chaos, felt like relief. Barbara did not absolve herself entirely. She acknowledged choices she might have made differently had she known how. But she also recognized the limits of agency when knowledge itself is withheld. One cannot choose wisely without a map. One cannot trust safely without having been protected. Her life had been shaped in darkness. That she found any clarity at all felt, to her, like a quiet victory in her final months. Barbara spoke less and listened more, not to people. There were few left who came, but to herself. She noticed the absence of panic, the absence of urgency, the absence of the old compulsion to fix what could not be fixed. She had stopped trying to make meaning for others. She allowed meaning to be personal. That meaning was simple. She had loved deeply. Even when it hurt, she had given generously. Even when it cost her, she had hoped stubbornly. Even when hope failed her. These were not flaws. They were traits that had gone unprotected. Barbara Hutton's life does not resolve into redemption or condemnation. It resolves into understanding, partial, imperfect, but real. An understanding that suffering does not require villainy, that excess does not preclude pain, and that loneliness can exist even in the most crowded rooms. As her body weakened, her inner world grew quieter, not empty, quiet. The difference mattered. Quiet meant no more bargaining, no more rehearsing alternate endings, no more waiting for a rescue that would never come, just presence. Limited but honest. On the last evenings of her life, the city lights below her window blurred into soft halos. Sound traveled upward in fragments: traffic, laughter, distant music, none of it demanding response. She listened without attachment, without longing. She had already lived the longing. What remained was acceptance, not of what had happened, but of what could no longer be changed. Barbara Hutton died having lost much, but she also died having learned something the world never taught her early enough: that a life can be understood even when it cannot be repaired. And sometimes, understanding is the final mercy. If Barbara Hutton's life were reduced to a single misunderstanding, it would be this: that people assumed money spoke the same language as the heart. It does not. Money is precise. It counts, measures, replaces. It resolves problems that have edges and answers. But emotional wounds do not behave that way. They are not impressed by scale. They are not softened by abundance. They do not respond to generosity unless generosity is paired with presence. Barbara learned this slowly, and at great cost. Every time she gave: another house, another settlement, another gift meant to smooth tension. She was attempting translation. She was saying, "This is how I know to show care." But money translated poorly. It attracted need instead of closeness, entitlement instead of reciprocity. What she wanted was not gratitude. It was attunement. She wanted someone to notice when she grew quiet, someone to recognize when her generosity was actually anxiety, someone to stay even when there was nothing left to offer but herself. That rarely happened. In the rare moments it did, brief, imperfect moments, she felt almost disoriented. Care without transaction felt unfamiliar, even suspicious. She had lived too long in a world where affection arrived with expectations attached, so even when kindness appeared, she did not always know how to receive it. This is the quiet paradox of her life. Barbara Hutton was capable of immense generosity, but deeply uncomfortable with receiving care. Giving allowed her to maintain control. Receiving required trust, and trust had never been rewarded. Over time, this imbalance became internalized. She began to treat herself the way the world had treated her, demanding endurance, minimizing need, dismissing pain as weakness. Her illnesses were managed, not nurtured. Her suffering was tolerated, not tended. This internal arrangement mirrored her external life perfectly. When Lance was alive, that pattern softened slightly. With him, she allowed herself to be needed without negotiation. Motherhood gave her a role that did not depend on performance. But even then, fear lingered. Fear of loss. Fear of repeating history. Fear that loving too deeply would invite disaster. And disaster came anyway, after his death. Barbara stopped trying to translate herself at all. She withdrew from the exhausting effort of being legible to others. If money could not say what she meant, she would say nothing. This silence was not emptiness. It was self-protection refined. In that silence, she confronted a truth she had avoided her entire life: that no amount of external validation could resolve an internal absence. That longing, when left unexamined, does not disappear. It simply migrates from one object to another. Barbara had migrated her longing repeatedly, from parents to husbands, from husbands to reputation, from reputation to her son. When the last anchor was gone, there was nowhere left to move it, and so she let it rest. This resting did not heal the wound. but it stopped reopening it. In her final years, Barbara lived without the constant ache of anticipation. She no longer scanned the future for rescue. She allowed days to arrive and leave without demanding meaning from them. This was not despair. It was realism. She had finally learned the limit of hope. Not hope as optimism, but hope as strategy. For most of her life, hope had been a tool, a way to endure disappointment by imagining a different ending. But tools wear out, and when hope failed repeatedly, it stopped being useful. What replaced it was not cynicism, it was clarity. Clarity that her suffering had context. Clarity that her choices had logic. Clarity that her life was not a series of random missteps, but a consistent response to early deprivation. This clarity did not rewrite her past. It reframed it, and in that reframing, Barbara found a fragile peace. She no longer measured herself against what she should have been. She no longer compared her life to fantasies of what wealth was supposed to deliver. She accepted that her story would always resist neat conclusions. Some lives are not meant to be triumphant, they are meant to be understood. Barbara Hutton's life was one of those lives, not a warning about riches, not a morality tale about excess, but a quiet study of what happens when a child grows up without emotional translation and spends a lifetime trying to speak a language she was never taught. In the end, money could buy her many things. Understanding was not one of them. She had to find that on her own, near the end. Barbara Hutton no longer thought of her life in chapters. Chapters imply order, progression, a sense that one thing leads cleanly to another. Her life had not felt that way from the inside. It felt circular, returning again and again to the same emotional crossroads, each time older, more tired, but still carrying the same unanswered need. What changed was not the pattern, but her awareness of it. Awareness arrives quietly. It does not announce itself with insight or drama. It shows up as a subtle shift in how one remembers. Barbara began to remember her past without urgency. The memories no longer demanded correction or justification. They surfaced, lingered, and passed. She let them. She remembered her mother not as a tragedy, but as a presence that had vanished too soon. She remembered her father not with anger, but with a distant sadness, a man unequipped for intimacy, hiding behind provision. She remembered her marriages not as failures, but as attempts made with the tools she had at the time. This reframing did not excuse the harm done to her. It explained it. Barbara understood now that much of her pain had come from living in reaction rather than intention, from responding to fear instead of choosing from security. But she also recognized how little opportunity she had ever been given to learn differently. The world had admired her resilience without ever offering her refuge. There is a difference. Resilience is often praised because it absolves others of responsibility. If someone survives, the story becomes one of strength rather than neglect. Barbara had survived many things. That survival had been mistaken for wellness. In truth, she had been coping. Coping is invisible. It looks like functionality. It looks like continuation. It rarely attracts concern, as her body weakened. Barbara noticed that people spoke about her in the past tense even while she was still alive. They referred to her era, her legend, her former status. She was already being archived. This did not frighten her. It relieved her. To be archived is to be released from expectation. No one asks artifacts to evolve. They are allowed to simply exist as they are. Barbara felt a quiet relief in no longer being asked to improve, to redeem, to surprise. She had done enough living, in the stillness of her final days. She sometimes considered what might have been different if someone, anyone, had noticed the pattern earlier and intervened. If her grief had been named instead of managed, if her hunger had been treated as a signal rather than a symptom, if her marriages had been questioned not for their optics, but for their dynamics. These thoughts did not torment her. They passed like weather. What stayed was a gentler recognition that lives are shaped less by intention than by preparation. Barbara had never been prepared for emotional safety. She had been prepared for wealth, for visibility, for endurance. She had done what she could with that preparation. The world often asks whether Barbara Hutton's life was sad. It was. But sadness was not its defining feature. Its defining feature was longing. Longing shaped by early absence, expressed through generosity, and misunderstood as extravagance. Longing that was never malicious, never shallow, never satisfied. Barbara had lived inside that longing for so long that she no longer resented it. It had been her companion, her motivator, her undoing, now, at the end. It loosened its grip. She no longer waited for someone to arrive. She no longer believed that another beginning would solve what had always been there. She allowed herself to be unfinished. That permission mattered, in a culture obsessed with transformation and redemption. Barbara's ending was quietly radical. She did not reinvent herself. She did not find late-life romance or spiritual awakening. She did not overcome her past. She understood it, and understanding, while less dramatic, is far more honest. Barbara Hutton died not reconciled to the world, but reconciled to her own story. She did not need the narrative to change. She needed it to make sense. At last, it did. Her life, when seen clearly, was not about money lost or love wasted. It was about a child who learned the wrong lessons too early and spent a lifetime trying to unlearn them without guidance. That clarity did not save her, but it freed her from self-blame. And sometimes, freedom looks like that. Not triumph, not happiness, but the quiet relief of finally knowing why your life unfolded the way it did. In that knowing, Barbara Hutton rested, not because everything had been healed, but because nothing was left to prove. There is a silence that comes after wanting. It is not the silence of emptiness, nor the silence of despair. It is the silence that arrives when desire has exhausted itself, when the mind no longer strains forward, when the heart stops rehearsing alternate futures. For Barbara Hutton, this silence arrived late, but when it did, it stayed. She no longer wanted to be understood. That surprised her. For most of her life, misunderstanding had felt like an open wound. The world mistook her generosity for foolishness, her fragility for indulgence, her loneliness for excess. She had spent decades aching to be seen clearly, to be known beyond headlines and shorthand. But clarity, she learned, does not always come from others. Sometimes it comes when the need for it dissolves. In her final years, Barbara noticed how little energy she had left for interpretation. She no longer explained her choices to herself. She no longer revisited old decisions with the hope of revision. The past, once sharp and insistent, softened into a series of facts, unchangeable, but no longer demanding. She had stopped asking what if. That question had ruled her life. What if she had chosen differently? What if she had waited longer? What if she had recognized danger sooner? What if her mother had lived? What if her father had stayed? What if love had come in a form she could trust? These questions did not disappear all at once. They faded gradually, like sound at the edge of hearing. Each year, they mattered a little less. Each year, the present, limited, quiet, imperfect, felt more real than imagined alternatives. Barbara discovered that peace does not come from answers. It comes from letting questions rest. Her days became smaller, but not poorer. She learned the texture of routine, the comfort of predictability. She learned which hours were easier, which moments required gentleness. She learned to stop fighting her body and start accommodating it. This was not defeat. It was cooperation, in cooperating with her limitations. Barbara experienced something close to kindness, directed inward. Without condition, she did not demand productivity from herself. She did not shame herself for weakness. She accepted care without negotiation. It was the first time she had done so. She did not frame this as healing. She framed it as necessity. But necessity, practiced long enough, can resemble grace. The city below her window continued to shift and change. New buildings rose. Old landmarks vanished. The world remained in motion, propelled by the same hunger for more that had once defined her own life. Watching it now, Barbara felt neither envy nor resentment. She felt distance. Distance can be lonely, but it can also be clarifying. From afar, ambition looks repetitive. Desire looks cyclical. The chase for fulfillment repeats across generations, rarely questioning its direction. Barbara recognized herself in that movement and no longer felt compelled to join it. Her life had been full of wanting love, wanting safety, wanting permanence. Now, she wanted very little. That did not make her empty. It made her light. When death came, it did not feel like an interruption. It felt like a continuation of the quiet she had already entered. There was no unfinished business demanding attention, no urgent message left unsaid. Barbara Hutton did not leave behind a final statement or a carefully curated legacy. She left behind a life that resisted summary, and in doing so, revealed something honest about the human condition, that longing, when unprotected, can shape an entire existence, that abundance does not inoculate against pain, that understanding, even when delayed, can soften the weight of what cannot be changed. Her story does not resolve into triumph or tragedy. It resolves into recognition. Recognition that a person can be both privileged and profoundly wounded, that suffering does not require scarcity, that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, can be a form of peace. Barbara Hutton spent much of her life searching for something to hold on to. In the end, she let go. And in that letting go, she finally stopped falling. The world remembers her as a headline, a cautionary tale, a curiosity of wealth and misfortune. But beneath that memory lies a quieter truth, one that does not announce itself, but waits patiently to be noticed. That she was not broken by riches, she was shaped by loss, and when the wanting finally fell silent, what remained was not despair, but a gentle stillness, earned, imperfect, and real. That stillness was hers. At last, every generation believes it understands wealth better than the last. It tells itself that excess has been analyzed, that privilege has been demystified, that money no longer blinds us to suffering. And yet, stories like Barbara Hutton's continue to unsettle, because they expose a truth that remains uncomfortable no matter how familiar it becomes. That money does not create emotional literacy, and it does not substitute for care. Barbara's life is often cited as evidence that wealth fails, but that framing is incomplete. Wealth did not fail her. It simply did what it always does. It amplified what already existed. It amplified her access. It amplified her visibility. It amplified her wounds. What it did not do was teach her how to live with those wounds. The world watched Barbara stumble publicly through lessons most people learn privately. It judged her harshly for failing exams she was never prepared to take. In doing so, it revealed its own confusion about what privilege actually provides. Privilege offers insulation, not instruction. It can buffer consequences, but it cannot model attachment. It can postpone reckoning, but it cannot prevent it. Barbara's life stretched this postponement across decades. Allowing patterns to repeat long after intervention might have helped, and when reckoning finally arrived, it arrived quietly, without spectacle, without correction, without applause. Barbara's story asks us to reconsider what we expect from people who are given much. We expect gratitude. We expect restraint. We expect wisdom. But wisdom is not an inheritance. It is learned in relationship, through guidance, repair, and example. Barbara received wealth instead of wisdom, attention instead of attunement, admiration instead of safety. She learned to endure rather than to trust. In modern terms, her life reads like a case study in unresolved trauma layered with unchecked access. But during her lifetime, there was no language for this, no framework that allowed her suffering to be understood as developmental rather than moral. So she was judged, not helped. Even now, the temptation remains to frame her life as exceptional, an outlier, an anomaly, a cautionary spectacle. But that framing lets us avoid a deeper recognition that her suffering followed patterns we see everywhere, only magnified by scale. Many people grow up without emotional protection. Many people mistake intensity for love. Many people give too much because they fear being left. Barbara's difference was not her pain. It was the visibility of it. Her life unfolded in public, where mistakes were permanent and compassion was conditional, where retreat was labeled weakness and repetition was labeled foolishness. The world offered commentary instead of care. And yet, despite all of this, Barbara did not become cruel. She did not hoard her wealth out of spite. She did not weaponize her pain. She did not retreat into bitterness or contempt, even at her most fragile. She remained gentle, perhaps too gentle for a world that rarely rewarded it. This gentleness is often overlooked in accounts of her life. It does not fit the narrative, but it matters. It matters because it complicates the idea that suffering inevitably hardens people. Barbara's suffering softened her. It made her more generous, more forgiving, more willing to give the benefit of the doubt, even when that willingness harmed her. That softness was not weakness. It was the residue of longing. As the world continues to consume stories of wealth and downfall, Barbara Hutton's life offers a counterpoint worth remembering, not as spectacle, but as mirror. It reminds us that what shapes a life most profoundly is not what a person has, but what they were taught to expect from others. Barbara expected love to leave, so she tried to make it stay. The tragedy is not that it didn't. The tragedy is that no one taught her it didn't have to be that way, and that lesson, still unlearned by many, echoes far beyond her name. Stories like Barbara Hutton's persist not because they are rare, but because they reveal something we would rather not see. They force us to confront the gap between what we admire and what we actually nurture. We admire success. We admire resilience. We admire people who survive impossible circumstances. But we are far less comfortable asking why survival was required in the first place. Barbara's life unsettles us because it resists the myth that resources equal readiness, that abundance naturally produces wisdom, that privilege compensates for neglect. Her story shows the opposite, that when emotional guidance is missing, abundance can become a magnifier rather than a solution. The world praised her endurance without questioning the cost. Endurance became the metric. Functionality became the proof. As long as Barbara continued to appear at events, in headlines, in marriages, her pain remained invisible. The absence of collapse was mistaken for health. The continuation of life was mistaken for healing. This mistake is common. We celebrate people who keep going without asking what they are carrying. We reward performance without noticing the strain it conceals. Barbara performed for decades. The performance was elegant, tragic, and endlessly consumable. What was not consumable was her inner life. That remained private not because she guarded it carefully, but because the world lacked curiosity about it. Curiosity requires empathy. Empathy requires slowing down, and slowing down was never the public's interest. Barbara learned early that visibility did not bring safety. It brought judgment. So she adapted. She made herself agreeable, generous, manageable. She learned to absorb criticism without protest, to accept narratives she did not author, to carry misunderstanding without correction. These adaptations kept her moving. They did not keep her well. As the years passed, Barbara became increasingly aware that the world preferred her as an idea rather than a person. The idea was easier to digest. It required no responsibility. It allowed others to project their beliefs about wealth, morality, and fate without confronting the human cost. The person was more complicated. The person had needs that could not be satisfied by attention. The person required patience rather than fascination. The person needed boundaries rather than access. Those things were rarely offered. Barbara's life invites a question that remains deeply uncomfortable. What happens when we mistake admiration for care? Admiration keeps distance. Care requires closeness. Admiration consumes. Care sustains. Barbara received endless admiration and very little care. This imbalance shaped her choices. It taught her to seek connection where it was visible rather than where it was safe. It encouraged her to confuse recognition with intimacy, publicity with presence. And when recognition faded, she did not collapse. She simply withdrew. Withdrawal is often misread as weakness. In Barbara's case, it was discernment learned too late. She recognized, finally, that the world had little interest in knowing her beyond the role it assigned. She chose silence not out of despair, but out of clarity. Silence was the only space left where she could exist without interpretation. In that space, she confronted the most difficult realization of all, that no one was coming to rescue her, not because she was unworthy, but because rescue had never been part of the arrangement. This realization was not cruel. It was liberating. Once she stopped waiting, she stopped suffering in the same way. The pain did not vanish, but it lost its edge. It no longer demanded action or explanation. It became something she carried rather than something that drove her. Barbara did not transform her life in the final act. She transformed her relationship to it. This transformation went unnoticed by the world. There were no headlines announcing it, no photographs capturing the moment. But internally, it mattered more than any public redemption ever could. She learned that peace does not require justice, that understanding does not require validation, that a life can be meaningful even if it never resolves. Barbara Hutton's story remains compelling, not because of what she had, but because of what she lacked, and how she lived anyway. It asks us to look more closely at the people we label fortunate, to question whether comfort is confused for care, to recognize that some wounds are invisible precisely because they are surrounded by abundance. The mirror her life holds up is not flattering. It reflects a culture eager to admire outcomes while ignoring origins, a culture that celebrates survival without addressing the conditions that make survival necessary. Barbara's life ended quietly, but the questions it raises continue to echo. And perhaps the most important of those questions is this: what would have changed if someone had chosen to care for the child she once was, instead of marveling at the woman she became? That question has no answer. But it deserves to be asked again and again, until we learn to see what we have so often chosen to overlook. If Barbara Hutton's life leaves us with anything, it is not instruction, it is responsibility. Responsibility to notice what is missing, not just what is present. Responsibility to ask how a person was shaped, not merely how they behaved. Her story challenges a deeply rooted assumption that once someone reaches adulthood, their past no longer matters, that choices exist in a vacuum, that consequence is proof of agency rather than evidence of history. Barbara's life dismantles that assumption quietly, relentlessly. She did not wake up one morning and choose instability. Instability was the environment in which her nervous system formed. She did not decide to equate giving with safety. That equation was taught to her before she had language to question it. She did not seek pain. She followed familiarity, and familiarity, when shaped by early loss, often wears the mask of love. This is the lesson no one taught her, that love does not require performance, that affection is not a transaction, that stability is not something you purchase or persuade. It is something you are offered freely, or not at all. Barbara spent her life trying to secure what should have been given, and when it was not, she assumed the fault was hers. This belief is tragically common among those who lose caregivers early. Children internalize absence as failure. They grow into adults who try to correct that failure through effort, generosity, loyalty, endurance. Barbara's efforts were simply larger because her resources were larger, but the pattern was not unique. In this way, her story stops being about wealth and becomes about something far more universal. What happens when a child grows up without a stable mirror? Without someone to reflect back worth that does not fluctuate with behavior? Barbara never received that reflection, so she tried to create it externally, through marriage, through visibility, through generosity. Each attempt failed because the source was wrong. Worth cannot be stabilized from the outside. It must be mirrored early, consistently, and without condition. By the time Barbara realized this, the realization came without bitterness. She did not accuse her parents. She did not rage at the world. She understood, perhaps too generously, that people give what they know how to give. Her father gave provision. Society gave attention. Neither knew how to give protection. That understanding did not heal her, but it did soften the edges of blame. In her final reflections, Barbara no longer saw herself as unlucky or cursed. She saw herself as unprepared and preparation. She realized, is the quiet foundation beneath every life that appears successful from the outside. People who trust easily were taught that trust is safe. People who choose wisely were taught how to recognize safety. People who leave when something feels wrong were taught that leaving is allowed. Barbara had been taught none of these things, so she stayed, she gave, she endured, not because she was weak, but because she was loyal to a fault. That loyalty, once a survival strategy, became a liability in adulthood. The world took advantage of it repeatedly, and when she finally withdrew, the world interpreted her withdrawal as failure rather than fatigue. This misunderstanding persists, even now. Barbara Hutton is remembered more for what she lost than for what she lacked. More for her extravagance than for her restraint. More for her marriages than for the loneliness that drove them. But the truest lesson of her life is quieter. That children who are not protected do not stop needing protection. They simply grow taller. That unmet needs do not disappear. They disguise themselves as choices, and that without intervention. The past repeats itself under new names. Barbara's life did not need to end the way it did. That truth is difficult to accept because it implies that suffering is not inevitable, that timing matters, that care, offered early and consistently, can alter trajectories dramatically, that some tragedies are not fate, but omission. This implication asks something of us. It asks us to look beyond appearances, to question narratives that flatten complexity, to intervene before patterns harden into destiny. Barbara Hutton's story cannot be changed, but the lesson it offers can still be learned. If we are willing to listen, not to the headlines, not to the spectacle, but to the quiet echo beneath them, the echo of a child asking not for more, but for enough safety, enough consistency, enough love that does not disappear. Barbara spent her life trying to answer that request alone. We do not have to repeat that mistake. Her story does not ask for admiration. It asks for attention to what shapes a life long before anyone is watching. And if we offer that attention where it is needed most, then her life, unfinished, unresolved, imperfect, will not have been told in vain. There are costs we know how to calculate: money spent, years lost, opportunities missed. And then there are costs we never learn to measure, the ones that accumulate quietly, invisibly, until they define the shape of a life. Barbara Hutton paid those costs daily, long before anyone thought to count them. The cost of growing up without a steady witness, the cost of learning self-control before self-trust, the cost of being praised for resilience instead of being offered relief. These costs do not show up on balance sheets. They cannot be recovered or reimbursed. They are absorbed into the nervous system and carried forward. Influencing decisions long after their origin is forgotten. Barbara's wealth insulated her from many consequences. It did not insulate her from these. As the years passed, the gap between how she was perceived and how she experienced herself widened. Publicly, she was an heiress who made poor choices. Privately, she was a woman navigating life without the internal scaffolding that allows people to feel safe in uncertainty. Safety is the invisible infrastructure beneath every decision. People who have it can pause. They can wait. They can leave. Barbara rarely paused. Waiting felt like abandonment rehearsed. Leaving felt like failure. She moved forward quickly because stillness reminded her of the moment her world had first gone quiet. This urgency shaped her life more than desire ever did. It shaped how she loved, intensely, generously, prematurely. It shaped how she gave, lavishly, reflexively, without boundary. It shaped how she endured, silently, persistently, at great cost to herself, to the outside world. These patterns looked like extravagance and excess. Inside, they felt like necessity. By the time she reached her later years, Barbara understood this distinction clearly. She knew that many of her choices were not expressions of freedom, but responses to fear. She also knew that fear had once been rational. A child who loses a parent without explanation learns quickly that stability cannot be assumed. What she had never learned, what no one had taught her, was how to update that lesson as circumstances changed. The mind that survives childhood loss does not automatically recalibrate in adulthood without guidance. It continues to operate as if danger is imminent. Barbara's life was shaped by that uncorrected alarm. She lived alert to shifts in affection, alert to signs of withdrawal, alert to the possibility that something good might vanish without warning. This alertness kept her engaged, but it also kept her exhausted. Exhaustion became her baseline. It showed in her body, in her illnesses, in her need for substances that dulled sensation. It showed in her increasing withdrawal from social life, her reluctance to form new bonds, her preference for environments that required little from her emotionally. by the time she retreated fully from public life. This exhaustion had become something like acceptance. She no longer fought it. Fighting had never yielded relief. Instead, she allowed herself to live smaller, quieter, slower. This was not defeat. It was adaptation. One final adjustment made by a woman who had spent her life adapting. People often interpret this phase of her life as decline. It was, but it was also honesty. Barbara stopped pretending that movement meant progress. She stopped mistaking activity for healing. She recognized that some wounds do not close, they soften. If left undisturbed, she left them undisturbed. In doing so, she relinquished the last illusion she had carried, that life owed her resolution. She accepted that her story would remain incomplete, its questions unanswered. This acceptance did not make her happy. It made her real. Barbara Hutton's life, when viewed without spectacle, is not extraordinary in its emotional logic. What makes it remarkable is how clearly it exposes the costs we usually ignore, the costs of neglect, of misattunement, of confusing provision with protection. Her life forces us to confront a truth we often avoid, that not all suffering is loud, and not all damage announces itself dramatically. Some damage simply shapes a person quietly, guiding their choices in ways that are only obvious in hindsight. Barbara lived inside that shaping, and in her final years, she saw it clearly. That clarity did not change the past, but it changed how she carried it, and sometimes, that is the most a person can do. Not fix what was broken, but understand why it broke in the first place. When people spoke of Barbara Hutton's life, they almost always began with figures. How much she inherited, how much she spent, how much she lost. Numbers were easier than nuance. Numbers created distance. They allowed people to talk about her without touching the more uncomfortable truth, that her life was shaped less by abundance than by isolation. Loneliness, unlike poverty, does not announce itself clearly. It hides inside crowded rooms. It survives inside privilege. It can coexist with admiration, attention, even love when love is inconsistent. Barbara's loneliness did not come from lack of company. It came from lack of continuity. People entered her life easily. They left just as easily. There was rarely a middle ground where relationships deepened slowly and safely. Everything arrived at once or disappeared entirely. This rhythm taught her to cling quickly and grieve repeatedly. Over time, grief stopped feeling like an event. It felt like a condition. Each loss layered itself atop the previous one, until mourning became ambient, always present, rarely acknowledged. Barbara learned to live with it the way one lives with background noise, aware of it, shaped by it, but rarely able to turn it off. Her wealth complicated this further. Money insulated her from practical consequences, but isolated her emotionally. People hesitated to challenge her. They avoided discomfort. They deferred instead of engaging. Concern was softened into politeness. Intervention was replaced by accommodation. Barbara was rarely told no. This did not empower her. It deprived her of friction, the healthy resistance that helps people recognize when they are moving toward harm. Without friction, patterns accelerate unchecked. Barbara's patterns accelerated for decades. By the time anyone expressed concern, it was already too late to redirect them. Her advisors managed her finances meticulously. Her doctors monitored her health closely, but no one coordinated these efforts around her emotional well-being. Each addressed a fragment. No one addressed the whole. Barbara learned to present herself as fine. She smiled when expected. She thanked people for concern. She assured them she was managing. She became fluent in reassurance, not because she felt reassured, but because reassurance kept questions at bay. This fluency was mistaken for strength. Strength is often confused with the ability to endure without complaint. Barbara endured extraordinarily. The cost of that endurance was invisibility, not to the public, but to the people around her. No one asked what she needed because she appeared to need nothing. And when she did need something, comfort, reassurance, consistency, she asked indirectly. Through generosity and loyalty. These requests were rarely recognized for what they were, so they went unmet. In her later years, Barbara recognized this pattern without anger. She saw how her own adaptations had contributed to her isolation. She understood that by making herself easy to be around, she had made herself difficult to know. This realization was sobering, but not cruel. It gave her permission to stop performing resilience. She no longer tried to appear fine. She simply existed. Those who remained in her life accepted this shift quietly. Those who needed more from her drifted away. She did not chase them. That was new. The loneliness remained, but it changed quality. It was no longer sharp or urgent. It did not demand correction. It felt settled, like a familiar room one knows how to move through without bumping into the furniture. Barbara did not romanticize this loneliness. She accepted it as the outcome of a life lived without consistent attachment. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant realism. When her health declined further, she did not seek heroic measures. She did not chase longevity. She allowed her body to set the terms. This, too, was a form of consent she had rarely exercised before. For most of her life, she had consented outwardly while resisting inwardly, agreeing to situations that felt wrong because leaving felt worse. In the end, she reversed this pattern. She resisted nothing. She agreed to what was. This shift went unnoticed by the world, but internally, it mattered more than any public transformation ever could. Barbara Hutton died not surrounded by spectacle, but by quiet. The numbers that once defined her life had lost relevance. They could not capture what mattered now, the long arc of adaptation, endurance, and eventual clarity. If her life is remembered only for its excess, something essential is missed. Her life was not a lesson about money. It was a lesson about loneliness, how it forms, how it persists, and how easily it is overlooked when surrounded by wealth. Loneliness does not always look like isolation. Sometimes it looks like a life full of people who never quite stay. Barbara lived that life, and in the end, she understood it. That understanding did not save her, but it gave her something quieter, rarer, and more honest than redemption. It gave her peace with the truth of what had been, and that, for a woman who had spent her life searching for safety, was not nothing. In the final stretch of Barbara Hutton's life, nothing dramatic happened. There was no last revelation, no sudden reconciliation with the past, no public moment that signaled closure. The world prefers endings that announce themselves, but Barbara's ending did not. It arrived the way most real endings do, quietly, gradually, almost politely. Her days became predictable. She woke late. She rested often. She listened more than she spoke. The rituals of survival were simple now. Medication, light meals, long hours of stillness. Her body, having carried decades of tension, finally dictated the pace without negotiation. Resistance would have required energy she no longer had. She did not resent this. Resentment belongs to people who still believe things should have turned out differently. Barbara had passed that stage. She no longer compared her life to alternatives. Comparison had exhausted itself. What remained was presence, not presence in the sense of mindfulness or intention, but presence in the most basic way, being where she was, without trying to be elsewhere. For someone who had spent her life projecting forward, imagining rescue, anticipating loss, this was a radical shift. She stayed. The city below her window continued its rhythm. Cars moved, lights changed. People lived lives that would never intersect with hers. She watched without attachment. There was comfort in anonymity, in knowing that the world did not require her participation to function. For the first time, she was not responsible for holding anything together. That responsibility had weighed on her since childhood, the responsibility to adapt, to manage, to endure in her final years. She laid it down. No one noticed the moment this happened, but it changed everything. Barbara stopped reviewing her life as a series of mistakes. She saw it instead as a continuous response to circumstances that had never fully resolved. This perspective did not absolve others, but it also did not condemn them. It placed events in context. Where blame loses its urgency, context does not heal wounds, but it does stop them from festering. In this context, Barbara could finally be gentle with herself. She did not frame her illnesses as failures. She did not view her loneliness as evidence of defect. She understood them as outcomes. Unfortunate, painful, but coherent. Her story made sense. That realization did not bring joy. It brought quiet. When death came, it did not interrupt her life. It concluded it. There was no resistance, no unfinished struggle, no sense of injustice demanding resolution. She had already released the need for life to justify itself. Barbara Hutton died the way she had lived in her later years, without spectacle, without defense, without explanation. The obituaries followed their usual pattern. They summarized. They simplified. They repeated familiar phrases. They closed the book with confidence, as though her life had been fully understood. It had not, but that no longer mattered. Understanding is not always public. Sometimes it is enough that it exists at all. Barbara did not leave behind a philosophy or a movement. She left behind a question, one that lingers not because it is dramatic, but because it is unresolved. What happens when a person is given everything except the sense that someone will stay? That question cannot be answered by money or morality. It can only be answered by attention, consistency, and care. Things that must be given early, before patterns harden into identity. Barbara's life reminds us that endings are shaped long before they arrive, that the final chapter is rarely where meaning lives. Meaning is formed quietly, in childhood, in the spaces between presence and absence. She did not need a different ending. She needed a different beginning. The tragedy is not that she never found happiness. The tragedy is that she spent so much of her life trying to earn something that should have been free. And yet, even within that tragedy, there is something worth holding on to. Barbara Hutton did not become cruel. She did not become bitter. She did not harden. She softened. Softening is often mistaken for weakness in a world that rewards armor. But softness is what allowed her to endure without becoming destructive. It is what allowed her to see herself clearly at the end. Her life does not close with redemption. It closes with understanding. And sometimes, understanding is the only ending available. The city continued below her window. The noise faded. And Barbara Hutton, once endlessly watched, endlessly judged, passed out of view, carrying with her a truth the world rarely pauses to hear. That what shapes us most is not what we are given, but what we are taught to expect. She expected love to leave, and she lived accordingly. That is not a moral failure. It is a human one, and it deserves to be understood. After Barbara Hutton died, the world kept moving with impressive efficiency. Hotels changed guests. Headlines replaced her name with newer ones. Money shifted hands, as it always does. There was no pause long enough to feel intentional. There never is. History prefers motion. It resists stillness. And so Barbara's life, once examined obsessively, endlessly narrated, slid quickly into summary. A few paragraphs, a few photographs, a familiar nickname repeated as though it explained everything. The poor little rich girl. The phrase survived her because it was convenient. It fit neatly into a culture that prefers irony to empathy, punchlines to process. It allowed people to believe they had understood her without having to sit with the discomfort of her truth. But after the lights go out, stories change. They stop performing and start revealing. Barbara Hutton's story, when stripped of spectacle, leaves behind something quieter and more unsettling than scandal. It leaves behind a question that cannot be answered by wealth, psychology, or hindsight alone. What does a person become when love is inconsistent from the beginning? Barbara became adaptable. She became generous. She became vigilant. She became someone who mistook presence for permanence and intensity for intimacy. Someone who learned to give first, ask later, and endure always. These traits are often admired in Barbara's life. They were costly. The world likes to imagine that suffering follows bad choices, that pain is corrective, that loss teaches wisdom in neat, linear ways. Barbara's life resists that narrative. Her suffering did not refine her into certainty. It refined her into patience. Patience is rarely celebrated. It looks like staying too long. It looks like forgiving too easily. It looks like hoping when logic says stop. Barbara's patience kept her alive. It also kept her vulnerable in the years since her death. Society has developed better language for stories like hers. We speak now of trauma, attachment, emotional neglect. We recognize patterns that once went unnamed. If Barbara had lived in a different era, she might have been understood differently, but understanding does not travel backward in time. What it can do is travel forward. Barbara's life offers insight not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. The same wound expressed itself in different forms across decades. The same question drove her choices again and again. Will you stay? This question shaped her marriages. It shaped her generosity. It shaped her silence. And when the answer remained uncertain, she adjusted rather than withdrew. That adjustment was her survival. The tragedy of Barbara Hutton is not that she was unloved. It is that love was unpredictable. Predictability is the foundation of safety. Without it, even affection becomes a source of anxiety. Barbara learned early that love could arrive and disappear without warning. She never stopped preparing for that disappearance, so she tried to make herself indispensable. She believed that if she gave enough, stayed kind enough, endured long enough, love would stabilize. It did not. But that belief was not foolish. It was learned. After her death, the material remnants of her life were dispersed quietly. Objects lost their significance without her story attached to them. Wealth, once symbolic, became abstract again, numbers in accounts, assets on paper. What remained was intangible. A pattern, a lesson, a caution that has nothing to do with money. Barbara Hutton's life does not warn against riches. It warns against assuming that provision equals protection, against mistaking attention for care, against believing that resilience is enough. Resilience keeps people moving. It does not tell them where to go. Barbara moved constantly, across continents, marriages, identities, until movement itself became exhausting. Only when she stopped moving did she begin to see her life clearly. That clarity did not save her, but it allowed her to stop blaming herself. And perhaps that is the final, quiet gift of her story. Not redemption, not inspiration, but permission. Permission to ask what shaped us before we judge what we became. Permission to recognize patterns without shame. Permission to understand that some lives are not broken, they are unfinished. Barbara Hutton's life ended without spectacle, but its meaning did not end there. It lingers in the questions it leaves behind, waiting for us to answer them differently, not for her, but for those who come after. Because the true measure of a story is not how it concludes, it is whether it changes what we choose to notice next time. When a life like Barbara Hutton's is retold often enough, it risks becoming sealed, fixed in meaning, reduced to a cautionary label. But real lives do not close so neatly. They continue to work on us long after the person is gone, asking uncomfortable questions, reshaping how we interpret others who follow similar paths. Barbara's story does not end with her death. It ends with what we do next, for decades. Her life was used to reassure the public that wealth cannot buy happiness. This was true, but incomplete. The more difficult truth was avoided, that happiness depends far less on resources than on relational safety, and that without it, even abundance becomes destabilizing. Barbara did not suffer because she had too much. She suffered because she had too little of what mattered early enough. This distinction matters because it shifts responsibility. It moves the focus away from personal failure and toward collective blindness. It asks not why didn't she manage better, but why didn't anyone notice sooner? Noticing requires slowing down. It requires curiosity rather than judgment. It requires listening for patterns rather than reacting to outcomes. Barbara's patterns were visible. They were simply misread. Generosity was mistaken for extravagance. Endurance was mistaken for strength. Withdrawal was mistaken for decline. Even her final quietness was interpreted as defeat rather than discernment. In truth, Barbara's later years represented the first time she stopped trying to earn her place in the world. She no longer bargained for love or visibility. She no longer traded herself for acceptance. She allowed herself to exist without performance. That choice, subtle, late, and largely invisible, was radical. It did not redeem her life in the way narratives prefer, but it did restore her agency in the only way still available to her. By choosing not to participate in dynamics that had harmed her for decades. This matters because it reframes her ending not as failure, but as refusal. Refusal to continue hoping blindly. Refusal to keep translating her pain into gifts. Refusal to confuse survival with fulfillment. Barbara did not conquer her past. She disengaged from it. Disengagement is rarely celebrated. It lacks drama. It produces no heroes. But it is often the first true boundary a wounded person ever sets. Seen this way, Barbara's life contains a quiet integrity that is easy to miss. She did not turn cruel when kindness failed her. She did not hoard when generosity was exploited. She did not weaponize her story against the world. She withdrew, observed, and accepted. Acceptance is often misunderstood as passivity. In Barbara's case, it was the opposite. It was the final act of discernment in a life that had been shaped by over-adaptation. She stopped adapting, and in doing so, she stopped bleeding. If her story teaches anything worth carrying forward, it is not about money or marriage or fame. It is about timing, about how early intervention matters more than late explanation, about how care offered too late becomes compassion without consequence. Barbara's life reminds us that children do not need perfection. They need consistency. They need to know that love will not disappear without warning, that mistakes do not erase belonging, that silence does not mean abandonment. Barbara did not grow up with those assurances, so she spent her life trying to recreate them in adult form. That effort failed, not because she was incapable, but because the task was impossible. You cannot build emotional safety backward. You can only pass it forward. That is where Barbara Hutton's story truly lives now. Not in biographies or documentaries, but in the choices we make when we encounter vulnerability disguised as excess, generosity disguised as need, resilience disguised as wellness. Her life asks us to pause before we admire, to ask what it cost, to ask what was missing, to ask what might still be repaired in others while there is time. Barbara Hutton's story does not close with a moral. It opens with an obligation to look more carefully, to listen more deeply, and to intervene more compassionately, especially when someone appears to have everything, because sometimes having everything is exactly what makes it hardest to ask for what you actually need. And if we learn that lesson, truly learn it, then Barbara Hutton's life will not have ended in silence. It will have changed the sound of what we choose to hear. When all stories are finished, what remains is not the plot. It is the echo. Barbara Hutton's echo does not shout. It does not accuse. It does not demand sympathy. It lingers, soft, persistent, and difficult to ignore once you notice it. It lives in the space between what we assume and what we fail to ask. After everything had been written, analyzed, and summarized, her life resisted closure, not because it was unfinished, but because it exposed something unfinished in us. We want stories to reassure us that the world is fair, that suffering is proportional, that outcomes reflect choices cleanly and logically. Barbara's life refused that comfort. She was not careless. She was not naive. She was not unaware. She was shaped by early loss that went unnamed, shaped by attention that replaced care, shaped by a world that admired endurance while neglecting repair. Her life forces us to confront how often we confuse visibility with understanding, how easily we accept narratives that explain outcomes without examining origins, how quickly we judge behavior without tracing its roots. Barbara Hutton became a symbol because symbols are easier to hold than people. People require patience. Symbols require interpretation. The world chose interpretation. But beneath that choice was a woman who lived day after day with the quiet consequences of emotional deprivation. A woman who adapted rather than collapsed, who gave rather than withdrew, who softened rather than hardened. That softness did not protect her, but it preserved something essential. It preserved her humanity. In her final years, Barbara no longer tried to resolve her life into meaning for others. She understood that meaning was not something to be performed or delivered. It was something lived, often imperfectly, often without witnesses. She accepted that her story would be misunderstood. She let it go anyway. That letting go was not surrender. It was discernment matured too late to change outcomes, but not too late to change how she carried them. There is a tendency to search for redemption in endings, to believe that understanding must lead to transformation. That insight must be rewarded with renewal. Barbara's ending offers a different truth. Sometimes insight arrives after the last opportunity for change, and it still matters. It matters because it frees a person from self-contempt, because it reframes suffering as context rather than failure, because it allows a life to be held gently, even when it cannot be repaired. Barbara Hutton died knowing why her life had unfolded the way it did. That knowledge did not make her happy, but it made her whole. Wholeness is not happiness. It is coherence. It is the ability to see oneself as a continuous being rather than a series of mistakes. It is the quiet relief of understanding that your pain had logic, even when it had no cure. Barbara reached that place, and that is why her story does not fade. It continues to speak, especially to those who appear successful, resilient, and enviable from the outside, but feel chronically unsafe on the inside. It speaks to those who give too much, stay too long, hope too hard. It asks a simple, uncomfortable question. What are you trying to earn that should have been given freely? Barbara spent her life trying to earn safety, love, permanence. She learned too late that these are not rewards. They are foundations. Without them, even the most dazzling structures eventually collapse inward. Her life is not a tragedy because it ended quietly. It is a tragedy because it began without protection. And yet, within that tragedy, there is something instructive, not as a moral, but as a responsibility, to notice earlier, to ask better questions, to care before patterns harden into identity. Barbara Hutton's life cannot be changed, but its echo can change us, if we let it. Not by romanticizing her suffering, not by reducing her to a lesson, but by allowing her story to complicate how we see others, especially those whose abundance makes their pain inconvenient to acknowledge. The quiet ending of her life was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of a question finally released, and that question still waits, patiently, for an answer in how we choose to live, to see, and to care. Long after the lights have gone out, long after Barbara Hutton's name stopped appearing in headlines, her story continued to surface in quieter places. It appeared in conversations about children who grew up too fast, in studies about attachment and early loss, in the private thoughts of people who seemed to have everything, yet felt perpetually unsafe. Her life became less a biography and more a pattern, one that could be recognized once you knew how to look. Patterns do not accuse, they reveal. Barbara's pattern was never about extravagance. It was about compensation. About how a person learns to survive when the ground beneath them disappears too early. About how survival strategies, once essential, can become harmful when carried too far into adulthood. She compensated with generosity, with loyalty, with patience that outlasted reason. The world interpreted these traits as flaws because it did not understand their origin. It saw outcomes without tracing causes. It judged behavior without examining the environment that shaped it. This is not unique to Barbara. Her life simply made the pattern visible. If her story matters now, it is not because she was famous or wealthy. It matters because it challenges us to rethink what we reward and what we ignore. It challenges the idea that endurance is always admirable, that self-sacrifice is always virtuous, that resilience is always healthy. Sometimes resilience is just a lack of alternatives. Sometimes endurance is what happens when leaving feels more dangerous than staying. Barbara endured because she did not know how to stop. She was never taught that stopping was allowed. That lesson, small, quiet, easily overlooked, is the one her life asks us to learn differently. What would have changed if someone had taught her, early on, that love does not require proof, that safety does not have to be negotiated, that being alone is not the same as being abandoned? We cannot answer those questions for her, but we can answer them for others. That is where her story still lives, not in archives or anecdotes, but in moments of recognition, in the pause before judgment, in the decision to look beneath behavior and ask what it protects against. Barbara Hutton was not a cautionary tale about money. She was a cautionary tale about omission, about what happens when a child's emotional world is left unattended because material needs appear to be met, about how easily society confuses provision with care, and how costly that confusion can be over a lifetime. Her life reminds us that safety is taught, that trust is modeled, that love, to be believed, must be consistent. Without those things, people improvise. Barbara improvised beautifully, painfully, for decades. In the end, she stopped improvising. She accepted what was. Acceptance did not redeem her story, but it completed it. If there is a way to honor her life now, it is not through fascination or pity. It is through attention, directed where it matters most and early enough to matter. Attention to children who seem fine too soon. Attention to generosity that feels compulsory rather than joyful. Attention to resilience that never rests. Barbara's life teaches us that the most important work often happens long before anyone is watching, and that by the time the world notices, it is sometimes already too late. Her story does not